Yo, what's up, legends? Welcome back to another part of What If Deku Had Cell's abilities. This is part 6, and trust me, we're going all out in this one. Huge shout out to my boy Big Teddy G3498, the mastermind behind this crazy collab. If you've been with me from the start, you already know how wild it's been, and it's only getting better. Thanks for the continuous love and support. Legends, couldn't do this without you. Let's dive in. Chapter 36. The Hunter Returns Home. Mina brushed Izuku's head that was on her lap. He had fallen asleep almost immediately after sitting down. She could feel the tension in his body after the day they had. Mina had heard of what Izuku did to keep his pack safe, and it showed. His usually muscular right arm was a mass of tendrils acting as an arm, and she could smell burned hair on him. Half of his hair had grown out and desperately needed a haircut, but she could see the aftermath of fighting villains in the woods for so long. His clothes were in tatters again, but that was an easy fix. The reason they were torn up is what worried Mina. She was worried about his mental health. Before UA, he had a peaceful life, then classes started and one crisis after another had hit them, and Izuku took it all head-on to protect his pack. First, it was the USJ, then getting ambushed at the mall, and now this. Mina looked around the bus to see most of her classmates in a similar situation as she was. They were still processing the attack that just happened. Kaken, most of all, was looking out the window with a distant look in his eye. She could see the set grimace on his face. Most likely guilt for Izuku risking his life to save him. And then there were the 3 missing classmates who were taken to the hospital by ambulance. Yairuzo, Jairu, and Hagakure were caught in the gas like the majority of 1B were. Turning her head forward, she could see Aizawa talking quietly on his phone, with an even more tired expression on his face than usual. She knew he was a good teacher even when he put up the front of being cold towards his students. She turned her attention back to Izuku on her lap and gently brushed his messy hair out of his face. They arrived at the hospital and Mina began to wake Izuku as gently as she could. "Tsu? We're at the hospital, it's time to wake." She shook him gently as the bus got in front of the entrance. Izuku woke up with a jolt after Mina's whispered words. He sat up and his tendril arm tightened together and grew blades as he looked around frantically. He saw his pack mates on the bus looking alarmed at his sudden movement, but no danger. He felt a tug on his arm and looked to his mate.
"It's Alricht. Zu.
"We're at the hospital to get checked out, you got us all." She smiled with a few tears threatening to leak out of her golden black eyes. Izuku nodded and calmed down. "Sorry," he said softly to everyone. There were multiple reassurances from everyone on the bus for his actions. Once he had calmed down, he took in his surroundings. Aizawa was the first to get off the bus and guided his class off. They were filed out of the bus and escorted into the hospital and its waiting staff. The doctors were already alerted ahead of time of their arrival. Aizawa followed them inside and watched over them as best as he could. He watched the feral child most of all. Izuku had taken it upon himself to make sure his whole class was safe, and he paid the price for it in an arm. He could see the tiredness of his student and the ever-vigilante eyes looking for any more threats. It pained him to see him in such a state. Izuku was led away by a nurse to a nearby bed in a large room with multiple beds parallel to each other. His packmates were also being checked by other nurses. Not everyone had been injured, so they were sent to the waiting area. His mate gave him a reassuring smile and hug before leaving with the others to the waiting area. Out of everyone, he was the most injured. Or it would appear that way since his clothes were in tatters and covered in dirt, but in truth, he was healed completely. The nurse sat him on a visibly reinforced bed and began to check his vitals. "We're going to need to take this off," the nurse said and gestured to his clothes. Izuku nodded and he pulled off his shirt and shorts. He wasn't shy in the least. 10 years in the woods would get rid of that. The nurse quickly gave him a new pair of shorts to cover himself, and he obliged. She calmed very quickly from her flustered state and continued to check him for any injuries that weren't there. She frowned and looked at him after checking one last time. "You aren't injured? A regeneration quirk?" Izuku shook his head. "Not anymore. I can heal, but I can't regenerate my arm right now. I don't have enough mass or the right materials." He looked at his right arm composed of a dozen thick tendrils and opened his hand a few times. The nurse pursed her lips. "You lost your arm?" What is your quirk so I can help how I can? A villain burned it off. Nothing but ash left. He sighed at the loss but would do it again to save Kaken. I need lots of food. Protein, calcium, iron, carbon, tendons, ligaments, and lots of calories. Izuku listed off what he would need to regrow his arm back to how it was. It's going to take me a while to grow it back. The nurse took that in with professionalism and nodded. We got some high-caloric and protein food bars. His stomach grumbled at that moment and she smiled. I'll be right back with that. She came back with a few large plastic-wrapped bars and handed them to him with a water bottle. Thanks. Izuku beamed at the food. Of course, you're free to wait with your classmates. She smiled and motioned to the door where everyone who was healed walked through. Izuku nodded in thanks again and quickly moved to the door while stuffing his face with a food bar. The first few he didn't even chew in favor of swallowing it whole to begin breaking it down for the energy. Hundreds of small tendrils inside his body did the work to break them down and begin to use what he needed. He found his pack mates quickly and went to them. They all looked worn out from the day and Izuku could sympathize with them. He sat next to his mate where he could watch over them easily. His eyes found the entry points of the waiting room and anytime heard or saw a person unknown to him, he watched them as they passed. He was drawn out of his thoughts when Mina placed a hand over his. He looked at her in curiosity and she had a soft smile on her face. You can relax, Izuku. This hospital is a specialized one for heroes. There's higher security around the area so you can rest. Her hand squeezed his hand in reassurance. Izuku nodded tentatively and began to let his tense body slump slowly. You weren't hurt, were you? He asked and looked her over quickly. She was part of the remedial course with Sato, Kirishima, Shiro, and Kaminari inside the building. He assumed it was safe, so he never checked on her. Mina shook her head. No, a villain tried to get in, but Aizawa and Vlad King took him out before he could hurt anyone. He turned into clay or something when he was hurt. It was weird. Izuku nodded in recollection of that villain. He curled his lip at having his prey get away just like Shiwaku did at the mall and the USJ. I know which one. I took him out while he was distracted with Zawa and almost had him before he escaped like Shanami did at the mall. They were working together. He snarled. Mina smirked at his mate's terrible way of forgetting the head villain's name. Her smile slipped when she looked at his arm. Is that who did that to you? She nodded to his arm. The rest of the pack was listening to him now, but Kaken spoke before Izuku could. He pushed me out of the way after getting released from that fucker. I would have been dead if he didn't. The asshole's fire was hotter than icy hots by a long shot. The blonde had his brows furrowed, but he spoke more quietly than his usual brusque tone. He looked up at Izuku. Don't do that shit again, you could have died. It's the job of the pack leader to watch over his pack. I can heal, you can't. Izuku said without backing down. You lost a fucking arm and half your face for fuck's sake. Kaken yelled at him. I can grow it back. Izuku yelled back. And stop saying bad words. Quiet down, Aizawa said firmly but not harshly. He stood at the entrance of the waiting room and looked over them all. As heroes in training, you will have to learn to risk evaluation, and Izuku did so. From what I understand, if he didn't take the hit, you would be dead or critically wounded. As much as I hate seeing this happen, he was right, he said to Kaken, but the words were for everyone. He sighed and rubbed his face as he continued. Yairuzo, Hagakure, and Jairu have been placed into care, and reports say that the gas was non-lethal and meant to incapacitate whoever inhaled it. They will be all right with time. The school has contacted everyone's guardians or parents about what had happened, and they should be here soon. The class took that in and let out sighs of relief for their classmates. After that, Aizawa let them rest and took a similar position to Izuku where he could watch every entrance in one of the chairs. The class quietly chatted as they waited for their parents to come and get them. The explosive blonde didn't bring up the previous argument and sat with his arms crossed, deep in thought. It was within the hour that the students' parents began to arrive with relief in their eyes. The ever-protective pack leader jolted to his feet when the first pair of parents burst through the doors. Many others also jumped at the sudden noise, but no one as much as Izuku, who had prepared to leap across the waiting room. He calmed himself when he saw the familiar face of Toshi's mother. She pulled him into a tight hug when he stood to greet her. After checking that he wasn't injured, she looked at his pack. She smiled at Izuku, who raised his hand in greeting. Aizawa took her aside to talk as Toshi said his goodbyes and joined his mother and teacher. He gave Izuku a reassuring smile as he left. Bit by bit, more and more parents came to get their children. 3 pairs of parents went past them to find their daughters in the hospital rooms they were staying at. Izuku was happy to see his classmates' parents arrive, each showing their worry and love for their child. It also panged in his chest at never being on the receiving end of that anymore. That changed when Nem arrived in a hurry, accompanied by Mina's parents. Namuri, dressed in her civilian clothes, rushed to Izuku and pulled him into a hug. "Izuku, I'm so glad you're safe." Izuku was surprised by the tight embrace for a moment, but melted into it at feeling the affection he heard in her voice. Tears threatened to leak out for the first time in a long time as he hugged Nem in return. He buried his face into the sweater she wore and relaxed with her arms around him. She pulled him away while looking him over and showed concern at seeing his arm. "Izuku, your arm." She gently touched the mass of tendrils in worry. Izuku sniffed a bit to clear his nose and looked at the arm. "I can grow it back later." Nem squeezed his hand and hugged him again. "I'll help in however I can." She released him after a short moment. "How are you?" she asked tenderly. Izuku shrugged and glanced over to see Mina in a similar situation as he was with her parents. "Tired mostly, kinda hungry still." As they spoke, Mitsuki rushed into the waiting area and found her son. "You brat, you are giving me a heart attack." She yelled and yanked Kaken onto his feet and into her arms. "Get off me," Kaken said after a moment of hugging his mother. "Quiet you. I could only think of the worst when I got that call." She let him free and looked over him as every parent had done so far with their child. "You're all right?" She caressed his hair. "Yeah, Mom. I'm fine," Kaken said without shouting. "And Izuku?" She looked around the remaining students waiting for their parents and found him with the other 4. "Izuku!" She went to him while dragging a mildly protesting explosive blonde. "You must be Mitsuki?" Nem asked her with a smile at the interaction between parent and child. "Hi, Aunt Suki," Izuku greeted with a smile. Mitsuki didn't wait for any invitations and pulled her nephew into a hug like she did with her son. "I just got you back. Don't you go disappearing on me again." She pulled back as she ruffled his hair and stopped at the horns that she just noticed. "Oh, these are new." She tapped on them and caught sight of the same pink girl Izuku had spoken about the last time they had talked. She smirked and whispered to Izuku, "Is that your way of getting her attention?" Izuku furrowed his brows in confusion and turned to his aunt. "Getting whose attention?" Nem snorted loudly and covered her mouth but didn't say anything. Mitsuki turned to her and greeted her. "You must be Midnight. Thank you for watching over Izuku. I'm Mitsuki." She introduced herself. "Please, call me Namuri." She shook hands with the Bakugo matriarch. I wouldn't be surprised if he turned himself pink in an attempt to match with Miss Ishido. She patted Izuku's head and brushed his long, newly grown hair back. She frowned slightly at that and reminded herself to get him a haircut before he decided to cut it himself. "I just liked her horns and wanted my own." Izuku grumbled quietly but still leaned into the touch from Nem. "Is that all you like about me?" Mina asked with a pout as she and her parents got closer. "I like everything about you," Izuku said with a beaming smile. Mina blushed at his earnestness and covered her face as Miwa chuckled. "I've seen her blush and get embarrassed more in the past months than I have in years." The Ishido matriarch introduced herself and her husband. The 3 women gathered up like old ladies gossiping while the younger generation of heroes was pushed to the side as they talked between themselves. Kaken grumbled but didn't argue as he let his mother make friends. Mina hooked arms with Izuku as they both watched the women begin to make plans and talk mostly about Izuku, much to his curiosity. The feral boy was thrown off by their sudden friendliness to each other even though they just met for the most part. Dai, Mina's father, was already used to his wife's antics and let me make new friends with the grumbling boy's mother. After talking for a moment, the 3 split up after changing contact information. The 3 families began to split up and head to their respective homes. But not before Kaken pulled Izuku to the side for a short moment. "Kaken?" Izuku asked his old friend Curiosity as he tried to speak. He growled and finally said, Thanks for saving me. I won't need it next time. I'll get stronger," he said with determination. Izuku's smile could split his face. "Of course you'll get stronger, but it's my job to watch over my pack, so your thanks is appreciated." He patted Kaken's head like the feral boy liked. It was an odd sight since Izuku was much shorter than Kaken, but the tendril arm came in handy as it stretched easily. Kaken growled again and batted the eldritch arm away. "Get those worms away from me." The two old friends parted ways for the time being as the bomber joined his mother in the car to head home. Mina was next to say her farewells. The pink girl hugged Izuku tightly as a goodbye and was sure to kiss him goodbye before joining her parents in their car. Izuku was the last to leave the hospital except for the three still unconscious packmates. He joined Nem in the borrowed car from the school. He waved Aizawa goodbye as he stayed back at the hospital with the other students. The ride back was quiet with Nem holding his hand over the center console. They arrived at the school soon after. Izuku took his bag from the car that he took camping with more things in it than he took when he left. He didn't tell anyone about that, but he had a feeling that Aizawa knew and didn't say anything. Nem walked with him to his room to say goodnight. She hugged him one last time before leaving him be. "I'm sorry you had to go through that again. You and your pack were supposed to be safe, but it was the USJ all over again," Nem said apologetically. Izuku wasn't sure what to say to that, but hugged her in return. "What's going to happen now?" Nem sighed and brushed his messy hair back. "Heroes will look for where they took Ragdoll. Sometime in the future, a detective will come around to talk to you about what happened. As for school, I'm not entirely sure, but it will be all right. I promise." She smiled down at him. Izuku nodded and hugged her. "Thanks." Nem tightened her side of the hug and made up her mind about something she had been debating while Izuku was away, but that was for another day. She let him go and kissed the top of his head. "Get some rest. I'll talk to you later." Izuku nodded with a smile and watched her leave his room. He waited for a moment until he couldn't hear her footsteps anymore and quickly grabbed his large duffel bag and opened it to see his trophies still all there. He pulled one out at a time to examine each one. First was one of the blades of that lizard villain's massive sword. Next, a piece of the magnet he realizes after was stuck to the blade. The fake eye from Muscle Man, the horn from the Nomu, a tooth that speared his chest, and the mask from the villain that almost took Kaken to who knows where. He set them next to each other on his bed to admire them as he finally pulled out the pristine bear skull. The others were trophies of opportunity, but the bear was something he wanted for a long time. With a sigh of satisfaction, he took all his trophies and left the building. Quickly made his way to his den and made a quick pass around his territory to make sure everything was how it should be. He caught the scent of hound dog and some old animal blood, but he paid no mind to the hunt of the man. The beast in the woods breathed in the familiar scent of his home and let out a long sigh. He crawled into the hole in the ground and found his den's comfortable silence. He began by setting his newest trophies next to the others in order. First was the bear skull, followed by the blade from the Stain copycat. He nodded in satisfaction at seeing his collection grow. His body reminded him of his almost empty stomach, and he crawled out of his den for a late-night dinner before bed. Chapter 37. Where's my arm? The day after the attack on the summer training camp came quickly enough. Izuku slept in as much as he could, but after years of getting up at the same time as the sun rose, it only made him turn in his furs until he got out. As he got out of his den, he checked his phone to see if anyone in his pack had contacted him for any reason. No one did, and he wasn't sure if that put him at ease. He couldn't remember what day of the week it was, but it didn't matter much since they were still on summer break. The hunter shifted and went for a hunt, a large one. He took down 2 deer to begin the process of gaining enough mass to make his arm again. He could do it now, but it wouldn't be the same as the rest of his body. It would be a regular arm with calcium bones and a standard nervous system. It would be less than he was used to. He took the blood of the deer and took all the minerals he would need to make his build the steel skeletal structure. He would need lots of iron from the blood and carbon from charcoal. He groaned at having to eat charcoal again. After completely devouring the 2 deer, he moved on to start a collection of charcoal. He knows that there are ways of getting the iron from Recovery Girl's medicine cabinet, but he doesn't want to ask for her help. He was stubborn like that. So instead, he found a clear patch of earth and began to dig a hole to burn enough wood for the charcoal. After a few hours and a big fire later, Izuku got a call on his phone. He pulled it out of his side and checked to see who was calling him. It was Gang, he answered with a smile.
Gong.
Izuku said with a smile. Izuku, are you alright? I heard about what happened at the camp. Gang Orca's voice boomed out of the speaker on Izuku's phone. Izuku's smile fell just a bit.
I'm alive.
He glanced at his right arm. Answer the question, Gang said sternly. Izuku grimaced and told his mentor about what happened. And then my arm was burned off. He heard a gasp from the other end and quickly added, I can grow it back. I'm working on it now. It's just gonna take some time. Your arm, Gang said morosely. You are sure you are all right? Izuku paused to think. I was just tired and worried for my pack. They have told me this sort of stuff isn't common, but it's the third time. He scratched at a stick to make kindling for future fires. Gang Orca heard the confusion in his voice. Hero schools getting attacked is not normal. Before this school year, I could count on one hand how many times villains attacked the students in hero schools. Yes, there is the rare crazed villain, but it's very rare for it to occur. He paused so Izuku could soak in the information. For some reason, the League of Villains have their sights set on your class, but we are working on that as we speak. As for your pack, how are they? Izuku felt more at ease at hearing the heroes were working on taking out the League of Villains with Shumnai at their head. 3 were knocked unconscious with some gas, but they were all right. They are still at the hospital, I think. The rest were all right with small injuries. I had the worst of it all to an extent. Gang took that in silence and nodded along. He was already aware of the injuries they had sustained to an extent, but hearing from first-hand experience was always better. I am happy to hear none of your pack sustained serious injury. Have you told Asato about what had happened? Izuku physically flinched at the reminder. She is going to worry. He feebly tried to argue. She is going to worry either way, but it would be best if she heard it from you instead of the news. Gang lectured. Izuku groaned slightly but nodded. Okay, I'll tell her right after we're done. Gang smiled on the other end. Good. Then get to it. And then hung up. Izuku glared at his phone as if the glare would come to the other end of Gang Orca's phone and hit him. He sighed and went through his phone to find Asato's phone number and dialed it. It didn't take long for her to pick up. Hi, Asato. He greeted her with some trepidation. Izuku didn't like to worry the elderly librarian, and him being at hero school seemed to do that more often than not. Izuku, how nice to hear from you. How have you been? How has Yue been? Asato's cheerful voice came through immediately. Izuku glanced at his arm again and answered.
I'm alright, I guess.
Asato caught the emotion in the tone of voice. What happened? She asked with some worry. He paused to think of a better way to say he was attacked in a supposedly safe location. Again. So we had the summer training, but we cut it short because it was interrupted. He said tactfully. Interrupted, how? She asked, but already had a feeling she knew what the feral boy would say. A few villains, he said meekly. But, it's all right, you don't have to worry. We are all right. He cut her off before she could say anything. Of course, I will worry, Izuku. I couldn't after I watched you grow from a young boy to a young man. She paused to take in a calming breath. What happened? She asked after a short moment. Izuku told her of the summer camp that was going well until yesterday night. He didn't tell her in detail, but he didn't lie about what had happened. After that, we all went to the hospital to get checked out, and then everyone's parents came. I've been working on my arm since I woke up this morning. There was a sniffle from the other side of the phone call. You seem to have a lot of bad luck recently. She tried to joke, but the wobbly tone in her voice was clear to hear. Yeah, I do, Izuku said weakly. He didn't like the feeling of hearing Asato cry because of him. You always seem to make the best of it, and for that I admire you. So, tell me, what do you plan with your arm? Asato said in a lighter tone. Izuku shrugged. Regrow it. I have enough mass to make it, but the bones would be normal. And that wouldn't work very well since the rest of my body is set at a higher standard with the nervous system and skeletal structure. If I just had a regular arm, it would break a lot. He was lying on the grass of the woods as he spoke. Asato hummed in agreement as he spoke. Yes, it would be for the best to gather what you need. Unless you wish to try something different like you did with your legs. She proposed. What do you have now? For an arm, that is. A few tendrils, well, more like tentacles, acting as an arm and hand. He flexed the arm in question. The dozen tendrils tightened together in response. Did you stick with the octopus tentacles as a base for them? I did. They were the simplest with the muscular structure. If I had gone with vertebrate tentacles, it would have been heavier and less flexible. As he spoke, the arm unraveled, and then he had 12 tendrils moving around in the air over him. It's all right how it is now, but it's odd missing an arm. They talked for a while longer as they went back and forth with ideas to have some variety to his appendages. Soon after, Asato had to go open the library and they said their farewells. Izuku continued to lie on the grass after the call was over. He rolled over and watched a line of ants carry some unfortunate insect to their nest. With a sigh, he stood up and let the ants continue their lives. Izuku continued with his task to reconstitute his arm back to how it was. He wanted to continue hunting for more blood to extract the iron from, but that would be a waste of resources. After all, he couldn't eat over 200 pounds of deer only to get around 4 grams of iron per deer. He recalls when he first did this process, and it took over 3 years to do his whole skeletal structure. He groaned out loud and cursed that fire villain for taking an arm. Stupid villain. He cursed softly and looked around just in case he was caught saying a bad word. Instead of mopping around the woods, he wandered inside the school to distract himself from the situation he was in. He stopped inside his room to put away the clothes he brought back from the camp. He wandered around the hallways to see what there was to see, but he was already very familiar with its hallways. He passed the infirmary as he looked out the windows, ignoring the old woman who he could fairly hear inside. He found himself in the teacher's lounge to find it empty. It made sense since it was summer vacation and they would probably be busy with what had happened yesterday. He remembered when USJ was attacked and it was busy, but he couldn't imagine how much worse this was. Not only were students hurt, but it happened for the second time this year. He sighed again and began to wander out of the teacher's lounge. Passing the infirmary, he ignored it again, but he couldn't ignore the door sliding open. Recovery Girl was standing there watching him carefully. He glanced at her and swiftly turned his head to ignore her. Recovery Girl let out an exasperated sigh while she rolled her eyes. Just get in here so I help you with your arm already. She walked back into her office. Izuku hesitated before walking inside with a grumble. Do you have 25 pounds of iron I could eat? What? Of course I don't. And don't go out and do that. It will hurt you more than it will help. She tossed him a large bottle of pills. Take 2 a day. 1 in the morning and 1 at night. Izuku caught the bottle of pills with his tendril arm and read the label. Iron pills, he said excitedly, but it dimmed when he saw the dose of each iron supplement. It's going to take forever with this. I ate more this morning, he groaned. Can't I have he paused to count quickly. 100 of these? No, you bull-headed boy. You need to take it slowly, otherwise you can get sick. This is the safest way to do so. Come back in 2 weeks when you finish that and I'll get you another bottle. Recovery Girl's words were final as she swiveled around to continue working on whatever she had on her desk. Izuku ground his teeth and grumbled on his way out of the infirmary with the bottle of iron supplements in hand. I'm gonna take a bite out of something. He continued to grumble. He had already taken in the carbon from the charcoal, and with the bottle of supplements, he could get started with his shoulder joint and part of the humerus. Ignoring Recovery Girl's medical knowledge, he opened the bottle of supplements and dumped them in his mouth. After consuming them all, he sat down on a bench in front of a window and focused on what he was doing to his arm. He was already breaking down the iron and mixing the fine powder with the carbon he had stored. With that, he added it to the calcium in the growing bone. He did stick with the spongy bone of the joint with a reinforced exterior like he had before. Bit by bit, the arm that was missing began to grow back. He didn't add any muscles since they wouldn't be connected to anything just yet, but he was happy to see his arm beginning to grow back to how it was. He regrew the thick tendrils of his arm and got up to find more iron to remake his arm. While it was no more than a nub, it was a start. Now to find something made of pure iron and eat it, what would a medical profession know? Izuku, what are you doing? The feral boy stood straight as he was caught doing. Izuku, an hour later, was prowling on the school grounds looking for that crunchy iron when Nem's voice startled him from his search. He was currently eyeing the nails on a wooden board. The board held up a few flyers for school activities and clubs, but he was sure he could take a few nails without the notice board coming apart. The feral boy casually took a step away from the notice board and his objective. He turned to Nem, who was eyeing him with suspicion in her civilian clothes. "Nothing," he said a bit too loudly. Nem raised an eyebrow and looked him up and down. With crossed arms, she responded. "Aha, that's not suspicion at all," she said sarcastically. "Suspicion of what?" he said innocently, his head tilted in obvious confusion. She walked closer with a smirk and pinched his nose, moving it side to side. "You're such a bad liar." She let go of his nose after some fun. Izuku clutched his nose in mock hurt, forcing some tears to come to the corner of his eyes. "So mean," he pouted. She laughed and brought his head into a tight hug. "You are so precious." She let him go and held him by the cheeks to look him in the eyes. "Now, tell me why Nizu told me you've been prowling the grounds, looking for iron," he said, garbled with his face mushed by Nem. She let go with a raised eyebrow. "Iron? Ooh, for your arm? Why not ask for recovery girl's help? Don't tell me you're still avoiding her." He crossed his arms at the mention of the old woman. "She gave me iron supplements, but they don't have nearly enough. And she said not to come back for 2 weeks. How much do you need?" She patted his head to keep him at ease. "At least 25 pounds. He pushed against her hand with his head. Laughing at his actions, she rubbed his hair instead. "Let's go on a trip. I'm sure we can buy out some pharmacies." She jangled a ring of keys with a smile. Izuku beamed up at her and joined her as they skipped down the hallways to the parking lot. They took a nice yellow car that had the scent of present Mike. They got on the road and began to head to the nearest pharmacy. They had music playing and the windows down as they drove. It was a relaxing day for Izuku. "Excuse me." The pharmacist looked up from the book she was reading to help the customer on the other side of the counter. She paused for a moment when she saw she was carrying one shopping basket filled with iron supplements and the young man behind her with horns had 2 baskets with the same items. "Yes," the middle-aged pharmacist asked politely. "You got any more iron supplements in the back?" The woman asked with her son peeking around the store. "I don't believe so. Would you like me to order you some more? It would take a week at most," she offered. While being a pharmacist, she had seen lots of odd quirks that needed specific vitamins or minerals to work properly. She had never seen anyone take her supply of iron supplements. "Nah." The woman waved the offer away. "We'll just hit the other pharmacist." She smiled down at the messy green and black-haired boy. The pharmacist shrugged and began to scan the hundreds of iron supplement bottles and bagged them. The total was quite high as they finished, but one more item was set on the counter. A snack that is usually eaten by animalistic quirk users. This one was lamb. She smiled and scanned it. "Lamb, gross," the woman commented with a mock curled lip of disgust. "What is it?" "It smelled good," the boy said, eyeing the bag where the snack was placed. He handed over a card for the payment without taking his eyes off the bag. "Meat from a young sheep," the woman answered, happy to sate his curiosity. "You two have a good day." The pharmacist smiled in farewell. "You too," the messy-haired boy said with a beaming smile, and the woman nodded in thanks. With bags in hand, they left. "What a nice family," the pharmacist said to herself as she sat back down to read. Izuku took another deep inhale of the bar of lamb. It was compact meat wrapped in a wrapper, but to Izuku, it was the best thing ever. The first bite was followed by another and another until it was gone. Now, the feral boy stared at the empty wrapper with tears threatening to leak out of his eyes. "It's gone," he said sadly. He had his tendril arm split into smaller tendrils with fine taste buds to savor the taste lingering on the wrapper just a bit longer. The hair-like tendrils picked at what was left. Nem watched him with increasing amusement at seeing him try out a new taste. She cataloged lamb as one of his favorite foods for later. She patted his head in comfort. "Think of it as a treat. If you have too much of it, you might get tired of it." The boy nodded at the logic and carefully put the empty wrapper away for later. He pulled one of the bottles out of the bag and read the label. When he was done, He opened the bottle to consume it all, but a hand on his arm stopped him. He looked at Nem in the driver's seat in question. I know you want your arm back, but if you rush it, you might make a mistake. Better to take it slowly to make sure everything works how it should. I'm not telling you to wait a week with each bottle, but don't rush it either. She finished with a smile. Izuku took that in and nodded in understanding. I'll be careful, he said seriously. He did take the whole bottle and tip it into his mouth, but he did take his time to break each iron supplement down and build it carefully into the calcium and carbon. Nem smiled down at him and let him work on his arm. She put the car in drive and began to make their way to the next pharmacy to buy out their supply of iron supplements and maybe a new treat for Izuku to try. She knew he deserved it after reading what he had done to keep his class safe during the camp. She reached out to brush his long hair to the back. He smiled at the contact and leaned closer as they drove through the city. Chapter 38. What day is it? If anyone else saw Izuku consume multiple bottles of pills, they would call someone to put a stop to it, but luckily for everyone, he knew exactly what he was doing. So far, he has taken 2 more large bottles of iron supplements since they returned from the 3rd pharmacy in the area. He had had a great time taking his mind off of what had happened recently with Nem. He was happy to have her near. As for the iron he needed, the arm was growing steadily with each bottle he consumed. He currently had a nub that resembled more an arm than before. Granted, it was only a few inches, but he was processing the rest of the pills he had taken. He even had to return to his den for another batch of carbon. He only stopped working on healing himself back to full when he got a message from his phone. He opened it to see he was invited to a group chat with 19 other people. Confused, he tapped the accept button. The invitation was from Mina, so he could guess it was his pack's phone number. Many rapid messages passed quickly before he got a chance to read one. He could see some numbers change into names that he could guess were his packmates. He was getting annoyed at not understanding what was going on, so he let the group chat go on for a bit until it calmed down. Finally, he could read that everyone was planning to visit the 3 packmates who were still in the hospital. He found the time and address, thanks to Mina, for when to arrive. With that settled, he went to tell Nem that he was leaving. After getting back from the pharmacy, Nem showed Izuku the staff housing and where hers was. It was a simple small home with its bare necessities. She told him that the neighboring homes were Present Mix and Aizawa's homes. They were identical, but Izuku could tell them apart by their scent. So, Izuku trekked over to Nem's home and knocked on the door. It wasn't long before she opened the door and smiled down at him. Come in. She nodded inside. Izuku wiped his paws on the doormat and walked inside. On the couch was a bowl of popcorn and a movie on pause on the TV. It was a clean home with everything in its place. Even the remote controls had their places next to each other on the coffee table. It was nearly the complete opposite of Izuku's method of keeping things organized. What's up? Nem asked as she plopped down on the couch. Izuku looked at the ceiling in confusion, trying to find what Nem was talking about. He heard her laugh and he turned to her again. I don't see anything. He pouted, almost certain that he missed something. Don't worry about it. She waved his pout away and focused on what brought the feral boy to her home. What did you need? My pack is visiting the other 3 who got affected by the gas later today. Just letting you know that I was going. Izuku explained. Nem looked concerned while her eyes flitting back and forth for a moment in thought. I'm going to tell you the truth and say that I don't like the idea of you, or any of your pack, leaving their homes until we've dealt with the League of Villains. But I know I can't keep you caged on school grounds forever. My only request is to send me a message that you're all right every hour or so. She was leaning forward, elbows on her knees as she spoke. Izuku nodded in acceptance of her request. All right, I will. So what are the heroes doing about Shamanaki and his league? Nem smirked at the name she was sure he was purposefully getting wrong for fun at this point. Keep this to yourself, all right? After Izuku nodded, she continued. Yairuzo managed to get a tracking device on one of the Nomu with the help of another student. With that, many heroes are planning a raid on their base. Izuku nodded along as she told him about the plans for the League of Villains. When is it gonna happen? He asked. As soon as possible, she said, reassuring. A few hours later, Izuku was getting off the train and following the directions on his phone. Luckily, the train station wasn't far from the hospital, so he arrived at the guarded gates easily enough. What wasn't so easy was the tall buff man who stopped him from entering the grounds of the hospital. Reason for being here? He asked gruffly but not unkindly. Izuku looked up at the 7-foot dark-skinned man in uniform. Visiting my packmates. The man raised an eyebrow but nodded after a bit. Don't cause trouble. And then he moved to the side, letting Izuku waltz past the checkpoint. K. Izuku waved and moved to the entrance of the hospital. Walking inside, he looked around, not sure where to go from there. He was about to pull his phone out to contact someone who could help, but he caught the scent of someone familiar. Looking around, he saw Toshi and Mina walking up to him. Mina with a smile and Toshi with a lazy wave. He beamed at them and joined them as they walked to where the others were. As they walked, Mina told him that Yaoruzo had already woken up earlier that day. The other two were still unconscious, but the doctors were confident that wouldn't be the case for long, as Yaoruzo for a good example of how fast the gas got out of her system. They soon found the rest of one chatting in the room where Yaoruzo was in bed and awake. Izuku greeted her with a bright smile. Ruzo, she turned at hearing her nickname and greeted him in return with a smile. But that smile dropped to alarm when she saw his arm. Izuku, what happened to your arm? She covered her mouth at seeing the obvious missing limb. Izuku shrugged. Lost it, kinda. I'm regrowing it, but I need lots of iron. He uncoiled the tendrils to show the nub he had regrown already. Nem took me to get like 1,000 bottles of iron supplements. He tightened the tendrils to make the closest approximation of an arm like before. How are you? He asked like the polite young man he was. Yaoruzo's brow creased in concern at hearing the simple explanation but didn't push for more. Better now. Everyone was filling me in on what happened while I was unconscious. From what I understand, you helped just about everyone get back to camp. It was super cool. You just appeared and bam. That Toga girl was trying to run away. I kind of felt bad for her afterward. She seemed really scared. Uraraka acted like she was Izuku pouncing on Toga. I felt at ease in your presence. Tsuyu croaked softly. He was a beast of the thickets of highest proportions. Not even my demons stood a chance against his will. Tokoyami waxed poetry. Izuku stared at Tokoyami as the bird-headed boy became uneasy at the single focused attention of the feral teen. He means that you did very well. Yaoruzo, she said with a wry smile at understanding that the feral boy didn't understand poetry. Izuku's eyes lit up in understanding and he beamed. Oh, thanks. I'll always protect my pack, he said resolutely. The rest of the class smiled at the interaction and chuckled at the reaction. Dark shadow crept around Tokoyami's shoulder and dipped his head in Izuku's direction. Tokoyami nodded encouraging to his quirk, and the shadow extended to be in front of Izuku. I'm sorry I lost control. Dark Shadow had his head lowered to Izuku in apology. Izuku never had a chance to take a good look at the quirk and watched it for a moment before patting its head reassuringly. Then you will learn better control, pup? No chick. Yes, that's right. He smiled at the quirk. I'm no chick. Dark Shadow said indignantly before nipping at Izuku's hand before retreating to Tokoyami's shoulder. Izuku is such a dad. Kaminari snickered. I was just thinking that. Kirishima nodded emphatically. Hear that? He's a pretty good dad. Toshi nudged Mina at his side with a smirk. Mina's ears burned and she slapped his arm. I can make bodies disappear. She hissed at him with flushed cheeks. Toshi chucked through the pain as he rubbed his arm. Tsuyu overheard the interplay and added her 2 cents. I can see him being a good parent. She nodded. I swear. Mina turned on the frog girl with darkening cheeks. Why are they talking about me being a father? Izuku asked confused. Then he gasped in sudden realization. You're pregnant. But we've only held hands. Was it the kiss? Is it a quirk? He looked at his mate as her face darkened even more in embarrassment. Stop. No, you can't get pregnant from hand-holding. Mina shouted and placed a hand over Izuku's mouth to stop him from continuing to say absurd things. And I'm not pregnant, she hissed. The class was close to an uproar of laughter. The only thing keeping them in check was the fact that they were in a hospital. You never know, premarital hand-holding is the leading cause of pregnancy. Siro gritted out through his teeth in an attempt to keep the bubbling laughter contained. Even the ever-composed Ida was covering his mouth and looking away with shoulders shaking. It is said that hand-holding does proceed to children, logically speaking. Anyone who opens their mouths again will get put on a list. Mina glared in embarrassment at everyone. How lewd. Premarital hand-holding. Why I never. Yairuzo said primly, hiding her laughter behind her hand. After calming down, Class 1A began to make their way out of the hospital one by one. Yairuzo informed them all that she would be released soon, and with that, everyone said their goodbyes. The class still checked up on Hagakure and Jairu, but they were still unconscious due to the longer exposure to the gas. The last ones leaving together were Kaken, Izuku, Toshi, and Mina. As they got onto the same train headed to another station to split off, Mina asked Izuku, "Any plans for the week?" She said casually. Toshi gave her a flat look and Kaken rolled his eyes. But only Izuku spoke. "MH, just working on my arm is all." "Why?" he asked, tilting his head. Mina smiled and shrugged. "Just curious is all." She hooked her arm on his elbow and leaned on him. Izuku was still curious about the question but shrugged it off and settled comfortably next to Mina on the train as the building sped by. The feral boy stop was first, so he got off to head off to UA and his den hidden in the woods. He waved at Toshi and Kaken goodbye and hugged his mate as he left. Before Mina let go of the hug, she whispered, "See you tomorrow," and pecked him on the cheek before the train closed the doors and it left for its next scheduled stop. Izuku furrowed his brows at the goodbye but focused on the contact he had with his mate. He skipped into his den with a smile on his face with the help of the GPS on his phone. The next day, Izuku got up and hunted to satisfy his hunger for the morning. He got to work on breaking down more iron supplements as he burned more wood for charcoal and the carbon that composed it. As he worked, his side buzzed and Izuku had a tendril to pull his phone from his abdomen. It was a message from Nem saying that he shouldn't eat anything too big for lunch and she would be back to pick him up before noon. Izuku found the request odd, but he acquiesced with it. Right as noon hit, Nem messaged him to head to the parking lot. He finished up what he was doing and snuffed any flames out before doing what he was told. He found Nem waiting by a car with a bright smile and motioned him to get in. He did so and they got on the road. "Where are we going?" Izuku asked, confused. Nem smiled happily down at him and ruffled his hair just how he liked it. "You'll see." The response only confused Izuku more since Nem had never kept anything he asked from him before. But he trusted her and let it be. So they drove in comfortable silence. Izuku kept his eyes glued out the window watching the building move by. Soon, the feral boy noticed some familiar places. They were from a foggy memory, but he recognized a park from when he had visited Kaken's home for the first time in years. Nem soon parked the car in front of the house he was just thinking about and they got out. Izuku was happy to see his aunt again, but was confused as to why Nem took him there and why she was still smiling. Nem tapped on her phone quickly before turning to Izuku. "Come on. I've got something for you." She smiled down at him from the doorstep. Izuku looked confused but went along with it but stopped and began to sniff at the air. Nem bopped him on the nose softly. "No cheating." Izuku pouted and stopped. "In you go." Izuku furrowed his brows but knocked on the door before hearing someone on the other side say, "Komein." He obliged and opened the door to be startled by multiple voices shouting in unison, "Happy birthday!" Izuku stepped back at the sudden noise but stood dumbfounded at what he was seeing. Mina, Auntie and Masaru stood with their hands raised with beaming smiles while Toshi and Kaken blew on party horns that unraveled when they blew in them. While the two boys looked grumpy at wearing party hats, they had smiles on their faces nonetheless. There was a banner behind them in big letters with "Happy Birthday" written on it with paint. Next to them all was Asato with a happy smile and a party hat of her own. Nem placed a hand on Izuku's still startled shoulder. "It's a surprise birthday party. Happy birthday." Nem bent down and gave him a tight hug. She let go rapidly when she heard a sniffle from Izuku and looked down at him in worry. "What's wrong, honey?" Izuku wiped his eyes clear but smiled as more tears leaked through. "I'm happy. Thank you all." He turned to include the rest of the people in the room. Nem gave him another tight hug and she felt his arms hug in return. "Of course, sweetie." she said with a soft smile. When she let go, Mina was right there to hug him next. He laughed in joy as he was given another hug from his aunt and then Asato. "I'm very happy to see you again. You've grown so much." Asato brushed his messy hair back and patted his shoulder affectionately as she smiled down at him. "Come on, let's eat. The food will go cold." Mitsuki broke up the interaction in her usual blunt manner. Izuku beamed and went to the dining room with everyone else. They squeezed in at the table with enough chairs for everyone but Izuku. When they tried to give him one, he declined on the reasoning that it couldn't hold his weight anyway. His solution was some carapace stilts just the right height for the table. When the Bakugos asked how he sat the last time he was there, he told them he used the same method. They chuckled and began to serve lunch. Mitsuki gave Izuku the first bowl of fried pork on a broth of noodles and some vegetables that Izuku couldn't name. The smell and appearance of the food sparked a memory from before the woods. As everyone else was served, Izuku was in a lost memory. A hand on his arm startled him from his mind and he looked up to see worried faces. Izuku felt wet on his face and wiped at it to see tears he didn't know were coming. "Do you not want it? I remembered it was your favorite from before," Mitsuki asked in a slight panic. "I can get you something else." She was about to stand but stopped as Izuku shook his head. No, I just haven't had it in a long time." Wiping his face again, he began to eat a spoonful. He ate slowly and savored the tastes that he remembered from before. "It's great," he said with a beaming smile. Mitsuki relaxed at seeing the smile and everyone dug in. Mina bumped shoulders with him as they ate and Izuku leaned close to her in comfort. Everyone chatted about nothing important as they ate while they enjoyed each other's company and celebrated the feral boy's first birthday in a long time. After a large lunch, everyone moved to the living room to talk for a bit longer. They mostly stayed on Izuku as a topic. When Asato first met him and the years after, Toshi retells the time the two met for the first time and how he took Toshi on a hunt only for Toshi to get lost after Izuku left him behind. Mitsuki tells stories about Izuku's much younger years with Kaken. Mina about the time he saved her at the exam by tossing half a ton of concrete off of her. And Nem told them about their outing to the city and their time together. Izuku listened to them all with a smile on his face. Soon, everyone else decided it was time for gifts. Mitsuki was the first to hand Kaken a wrapped bag with a bow tie on top of it, and then he presented it to Izuku. He took it as his eyes lit up like a child's. "Kat gave us the idea of what to get you." Mitsuki ruffled her son's hair as he tried to bat her hand away. "Open it up," she said, smiling. Izuku did so with careful movements. He didn't want to damage whatever his first gift was. He pulled out a few articles of clothing. 3 pairs of tank tops and shorts made of the same fabric with dark green colors. They looked simple but sturdy. Izuku looked up from the floor where he was seated and beamed up a smile. "Thank you, Auntie Suki, Kaken Masaru." She laughed and Masaru smiled at the earnestness of the boy. "It's not just some clothes but self-repairing and form-fitting, so they should last you a good while. Kat told us how you usually ended up with torn clothes and just thought it was perfect," she said, beaming. She then knelt and gave him a tight hug. "Hope you enjoy them." Kaken gave him a nod over his mother's shoulder. After she was done delivering their gift to him, Asato lifted a box from the side where she was seated and slid it over to him. She motioned him to open it. "Go on," she said with a soft smile. Opening the box, Izuku pulled out 3 large books titled Quirk Biology, Human Anatomy, and Animal Anatomy. "They are the most advanced things I could get my hands on." Izuku held the books on his lap like they were his children. "This is great. Thanks, Asato," he said gratefully. Mina and Toshi were next. Toshi gave him a framed photo from one of the times before UA. It was Toshi holding up the phone outside Izuku's old den, with the insomniac giving a lazy smile and Izuku beaming at the camera, while Mina gave him a large sweater and a thick flannel blanket. He thanked them both with tight hugs and immediately put the sweater on. It hung down to above his thighs and he was able to tuck his legs into it comfortably. Nem was last with the gift-giving. She got up and pulled a manila folder from her bag. She knelt across from Izuku. "This an optional gift if you want it." She smiled softly at him and slid it across the coffee table. Confused at the words, Izuku picked up the folder gingerly and opened it. There were a few papers and Izuku read them. Mina and Toshi on either side peeking over his shoulder to read them as well. The feral boy began to understand the forms and tears began to crop up as he looked at Nem. "You want to be my mom?" he asked with roiling emotions surfacing. "Like I said, you don't have to agree. I haven't signed in dash." She cut off as Izuku rounded the table and hugged her. She wrapped her arms around him tightly in return as his shoulders shook in sobs. "Is that a yes?" She felt Izuku nod and his horns poking at her at the movement. The rest of the room smiled at the sweet scene of the two as Izuku continued to cry in the tithe of emotions from joy to bittersweetness from remembering his biological mother and how much better Nem was just in the short time he knew her. Nem in return was thrilled at Izuku accepting what she gave him as a gift and was relieved that it didn't turn out any other way. "I'm so happy," Nem said into Izuku's messy hair. "I almost came to blows with Mitsuki over who got to adopt you." She joked and felt Izuku giggle. "Would have been different if I had my gun on me at the time," Mitsuki grumbled. Kaken whipped his head to stare at her. "Gun?" Toshi was able to read Izuku's emotions in time to roll under the coffee table. Looked up at the blonde woman. "I would have watched that fight." "The gun is only for emergencies, dear," Masaru said calmly, placating his wife. "Damn right. It would have been an emergency for her." She smirked. She wasn't truly upset but happy for her nephew getting a good mother like he deserved. Chapter 39. Time with Nem. The rest of Izuku's birthday was spent hanging out with his friends and mate. He was feeling especially happy with Nem adopting him as her son. It was a good day for Izuku, and it was made better to see on his phone there were multiple notifications from both the group chat and others wishing him a happy birthday. Gang Orca had sent him an animated emoji of an orca jumping over a birthday banner, and his packmates had each sent their well-wished in the chat. But things had to come to an end as the sun got lower and lower. Asato was the first to go, but not before giving Izuku another hug and saying her goodbyes. Nem finally decided it was getting too late and got Toshi, Mina, and Izuku into her car to drive each one home. Mitsuki and Kaken gave their farewells to Izuku with Masaru giving him a wave and simple nod. Toshi stole the front passenger seat before Izuku could, and he happily sat next to Mina on their way to their homes. Mina was closest to Kaken's home and kissed Izuku on the cheek before leaving the car. They dropped off Toshi next, and then it was the two Kiyamas. Izuku's smile never left his face as they drove back to UA. Nem also was sporting a smile and had her hand brushing her son's hair to the side the whole ride home. Instead of going back to his den like usual, Izuku stayed with Nem and watched movies with her late into the night. They watched comedies to slasher horror films until they fell asleep. Nem slept on the couch and Izuku with a pillow on the ground next to the couch. Izuku jolted to full wakefulness when he heard a creak of a floorboard next to him. He relaxed when he saw a somewhat guilty Nem trying to tiptoe around his sprawled-out form on the ground. He let out a large yawn and rubbed his eyes as he woke up properly. "Sorry, I woke you. How'd you sleep?" Nem asked with a smile as she continued her path to the kitchen. Izuku stretched like a cat with multiple joints popping in sequence. His muscles flexed and stretched as he got up fully. "Good. And you?" he asked his adoptive mother. Nem shook her head ruefully at the ease of him being able to wake up and stretch the way he did. "Pretty good. I bought that couch just because it was so comfortable to sleep on, but I'm still jealous of your ability to stretch like that, what I wouldn't do to be able to do that," she said wistfully as she began to boil water for coffee. "Would you like to stay for some breakfast?" Izuku nodded happily to join his mother for breakfast. He didn't know anything about cooking except that meat turns brownish when it's cooked, and that was all. So instead, Nem chatted with him as she cooked up a simple breakfast of eggs, toast, and bacon. They chatted about the rest of the school year and what there would be to look forward to. They talked about the movies they watched, and Nem explained some concepts to Izuku that he didn't understand at the time. As they ate, Nem perked up in delight. "Oh, I've got a great movie for you to watch next time. There's a similarity between you and the antagonist that usually the bad guy but could just be the opposite of the protagonist anyway. It's a super old film from before Quirks. It's called The Predator." She continued to explain the base of the movie, and the more she talked the more Izuku was intrigued by the movie and its subsequent sequels. "That does sound a lot like me," Izuku said with a gleam in his eyes. Nem beamed at his interest and then froze at realizing what she had just done. She introduced a very impressionable boy with the unlimited ability to mimic other organisms to make him even more dangerous. Her mind flashed with the hundreds of horrifying things he could do by copying some films. Say, Izuku? She asked casually. Remember those parasites that you created to paralyze the Nomu? Could you, I don't know, make them multiply? Like they eat and then multiply over and over again. She soaked up the yolk egg with her toast. Easily, Izuku said, smiling and raising a tendril with a pink tip that looked different from the rest of his flesh. But that would be hard to control afterward, unless I instilled some sort of phenomenon or hive mind linked to me to stop them or the like. Probably something similar to bees or ants. Most likely ants, since they use pheromones to communicate. Bees do the same, but to a lesser degree while using movements or dances to talk to each other. Izuku lectured using one of his best knowledge bases, animal biology. Why? Do you need one? I can have them die after a few minutes of being alive if you want. He asked when he was done talking. He extended a tendril and a bone spear with the parasite tip grew to give to Nem. Nem was surprised at how easily he knew so much about such things, but remember that he spent a lot of his free time in the library researching such things. She felt better knowing that Izuku wasn't creating things he didn't understand or know how to control. She smiled at his offer and shook her head. I was just worried you would make something that would end disastrously. Lots of horror movies start like that. Someone creates something and it spirals out of control and kills everyone. She waved her fork around, picturing some movies that came to the forefront. Izuku nodded vigorously. Toshi told me about some stories like that. He said my quirk reminded him a lot of them. But I'm careful, he said reassuringly. That's good to hear. Nem smiled at him and took his empty plate away to wash. You know you don't have to stick around if you want to head to your den, but you're free to stay as long as you want and come anytime. You are my son and this is my home and yours too, Nem said gently. Izuku's eyes teared up just a bit and he sucked them back in before getting up from his carapace stilts and hugging her. Thank you. He didn't specify what he was thanking her for. Nem set the plates down and hugged him tightly in return. Of course, sweetie. She kissed the top of his head between his horns and ruffled his hair. Now go play in the woods like all the boys your age do, she said teasingly. Izuku beamed at her. He left her home and headed straight to his den to continue working on his arm and maybe read the books Asato gifted him. He had them stored in his room with the other gifts he received. So he went to retrieve them and bring them to his den. He left the clothes he got from his Auntie Suki in his room but brought the rest to his little clearing. Opening his den with his tendrils, he leapt down to place some of the things he brought. He set the picture from Toshi next to his furs where he slept and had a small solar lamp. He set the blanket from Mina on the furs for later and kept the hoodie on. He went back outside and sat next to his fire pit with the animal biology book and a few bottles of iron supplements. Then he got to work. As he read, he took the iron pills to continue building his arm. It was a slow and tedious process, but the book helped him from dying from boredom. The book goes in-depth into unique animal biology such as the mantis shrimp eyes he used frequently. It told him how they worked and why they developed in such a way. That was just one of the many types of animals he read about, and some ideas did crop up and many others were tossed to the side as impracticable. Such as a moray eel's secondary jaw is called the pharyngeal jaw, which helps the eel drag its prey into its mouth to consume it. While neat, it didn't seem like any kind of addition Izuku would make to his body. This continued into late at night with the only break to get food and a quick nap. Izuku only stopped when it became more difficult to read with such little light and thought up a brilliant idea. He flipped the thick book to the index and found what he was looking for. After some quick reading with the dwindling sunlight, he figured it out. A tendril with a translucent bag on the end hung in front of him. First, it did nothing. Then, it began to emit a whitish light. Izuku beamed brilliantly at reading about such a simple thing as bioluminescent and figuring out what the animals did to make it work. He took the example from an anglerfish and had the glowing bag hang over his head to provide enough light to continue reading under the starlight. A long time later, once the stars had been out for a time, Izuku felt the ground shake ever so slightly. The feral boy stopped his reading and placed his palm on the earth. This hadn't been his first earthquake, so he wasn't alarmed. The first time he had experienced an earthquake when he was a lost boy, he had thought the world was ending. Later, in Asato's library, he had learned of them and what caused them. But as Izuku felt at the ground for any more tremors, there weren't any. The feral boy shrugged and kept on reading until he grew drowsy and slept under the stars. A few days passed like that, with Izuku reading Asato's gifts and working on regrowing his arm. The only notable event was that All Might fought some villain and destroyed a city block in the process. He found out the next morning when he glanced at his phone to see a few messages in the group chat about what had happened. He clicked on the news article about the event and watched the video. The whole country was in shock at seeing All Might's true form. To Izuku, it was just a notable event. The bad news from that was in the battle, Shimenashi escaped with the others that remained of the vanguard. During the few days, he spent time with his mom watching movies, reading, or talking with his friends. Apparently, the school decided to turn into a boarding school. Izuku had to interrupt Nem's news about that to know what was a boarding school. Izuku was ecstatic to hear his pack was going to live together in a building near his den. That made Izuku feel like it was a true pack with them living together. That would mean he would have to move his stuff into the dorms when they were done building them, but the good news was that Nizu decided to build them near his forest. He was very grateful for that. When summer break was close to ending, Izuku was at the newly built dorms and explored the empty building with Nem by his side. They had moved all of Izuku's clothes and belongings into his room before the rest of his pack arrived. His room was on the ground floor and his window opened up to the view of his territory. It wasn't very far and Izuku was very happy with his new accommodations. "This is pretty nice," Nem said, looking around at the kitchen and common room. She opened a few cabinets to peek inside. Izuku was sniffing at the new furniture and patted around where he would be living for the foreseeable future. "What's this?" He pointed at a board with columns. Nem found what he was pointing at. "Oh, that's a chore board. Since you all will be living in the dorms, you all will have the responsibility to keep it clean and orderly, well, as much as a bunch of teenagers can," she explained. Izuku nodded along and asked, "What are chores?" He tilted his head in question. Nem smiled and chuckled at hearing the question. "Household tasks like sweeping the kitchen, taking out the garbage, vacuuming, or cooking." She patted his head affectionately. "I don't know how to do any of that, except maybe taking out the garbage." He leaned into her touch. She rubbed his messy hair with a smile. "You'll learn. All right, I'm off. I've got some work to do before heading out to patrol." She kissed the top of his head before leaving. "Don't cause any trouble." Izuku beamed at her and waved. "I'll try." With a laugh, she left through the front doors. With that, the feral boy was left alone in the dorms. He looked around the common room before wandering outside the dorms. The yard was nice and had a few trees and bushes lining the entrance of the dorms. It was nice and sunny out, so he sat under a tree and laid back to take a nap before the rest of his pack arrived. Toshi arrived at the dorm with his mother a couple of hours later. His stuff had already arrived before them due to the moving company Yue had hired for everyone. He stared up at the building with some surprise since it hadn't been there. There were a few others already there, all of them around the shade of a tree. And under that tree, napping without a care in the world, was his best friend. He heard his mother snicker at seeing the same thing. After a tight hug and many embarrassing kisses, she left him with his classmates. He approached the rest and sat next to Kaminari, who was lazily swiping his phone screen while laying back against the tree trunk. Toshi froze mid-step when he saw what else was near. A Bengal cat was sleeping on top of Izuku's chest. "Whose cat is that?" Toshi loved cats, but his mother was allergic, so it was a distant dream of ever having one, but now there was one right before him. "Yo!" Kirishima greeted with a smile. "No clue. I was the first to arrive after Izuku here, but he was already asleep and with the cat. Maybe it's his." He shrugged. "I think it's a stray," Tsuyu said, crouched down next to Izuku and the cat. "A pretty friendly stray if you ask me." She gently stroked the cat's back and it purred softly without opening its eyes. "Kinda weird, don't you think? Most animals are afraid of him, aren't they?" Kaminari said out loud. His eyes turned to the resident animal expert, Koji. Koji shrugged. "It's a mixed bag with him. Most steer clear of him while others just think of him as the perfect predator and admire him. Kinda It's mostly birds that admire him since he doesn't like to hunt them, from what I've heard. When everyone visited my home to study for the midterms, the guard dogs followed him like he was their leader. It was quite cute but also interesting. I believe it's part of his animal presence. Yairuzo said, smiling at the cat on Izuku's chest. The cat chirped and shuffled around on his chest before settling down. I remember that. Jairu smiled in remembrance. Izuku was somewhat aware of his surroundings as he napped. Living in the woods would do that to you, so he wasn't surprised at seeing most of his packmates around him. What surprised him was the cat who stared at him from his chest. He stared at it back. The spotted cat raised its paw, placed it on Izuku's cheek, and let out a long meow. Izuku was confused about what was happening. You have been blessed. Praise be. Kaminari said reverently. Praise be. A few whispered jokingly in response. Izuku sat up and the cat sat on his knee and stared at him. He inspected the spotted cat and even sniffed it, but it was completely unfamiliar to him. You can hunt in my territory. Now shoo. Izuku picked up the cat and placed her on the ground. She chirped up at him and bounded off to the woods. Did she understand you? Toshi asked incredulously. Everyone turned to Koji, who looked confused. Cats are notoriously difficult to speak with, mostly because they think we're under them as we take care of them. Most are very arrogant. What did that one say? Jairu asked. She said meow. That's what confuses me. Koji shook his head and shrugged. Suku. Two small voices shouted in unison from the entrance of the gate to the dorms. Izuku turned at the familiar voices and beamed at the Ishido twins barreling right at him. The two hugged each side of him and then began to ramble on about what had happened to them since he had last seen them. Izuku listened attentively to each of them and nodded along even if he didn't understand a lot of what they were saying. Mina rounded the corner and glowered at her twin sibling already hounding Izuku. Kaori was climbing on Izuku's shoulder to see if he could reach the tree branch over him while Saori played with his tendril arm. He was almost done regenerating. She was still chatting with Izuku as he let them do what they wanted, while making sure Kaori didn't fall off his shoulder with a few tendrils hovering around the boy, who was kneeling on Izuku's shoulder precariously. The rest of her classmates looked on in amusement as her siblings were around the local feral boy. Will you two get out of here and leave him alone? Mina growled at them as she approached. Saori responded by sticking her tongue at her sister and Kaori ignored her. You're just jealous, Saori said defiantly. Mina's cheeks burned ever so slightly at that remark. All right, you two. It's time to go, Miwa said gently. The twins obeyed simultaneously by agreeing. Izuku set Saori down by hand and Kaori with the tendrils. Off you go, pups. Bye. The two ran off to Miwa, who smiled happily at Izuku before leaving with the twins. Mina huffed before hooking arms with Izuku. Not jealous, she muttered. MH. Izuku turned to her in confusion but shrugged it as they approached their packmates. Tsuyu was the first to speak. Izuku, do you like children? You seemed very adept while with Mina's siblings. Izuku beamed. They are the best. The class chuckled at his response while Tsuyu looked at Mina on his arm and wiggled her eyebrows suggestively in lieu with the subject of kids. Mina's face burned slightly and glared at her friend before tightening her grip on his elbow. She looked at Izuku before smiling and plucking a few strands of hair off his shirt. Why do you have cat hair on your chest? Mina asked in confusion. Chapter 40. The dorms. Everyone here? Aizawa didn't wait for a response before continuing. Good. While it's still summer break, we will continue the training on campus after the interruption at camp. His eye briefly flickered to Izuku's asymmetrical arm before looking over the whole class again. Crime will rise due to the fact of All Might's retirement, which is why Nizu decided to push the first years to get your provisional hero licenses. The class chatted excitedly at the prospect while Izuku looked around at his pack in confusion. Zawa, what's that? It's the driver's permit to your hero license, Aizawa said with an unamused look at the nickname. We need licenses to drive? The feral boy asked confused. We need licenses to be heroes? I thought it was like a job like being a doctor. He asked, even more confused. There were a few giggles in the small crowd of students at their class president's words. Meanwhile, their teacher was looking up at the sky for guidance. Why? He asked the heavens. With a long-suffering sigh, He looked down at the green-haired boy. You will need to pass qualification to obtain the hero provisional license to show your competence to be a hero, then another test to get your hero licenses. Izuku absorbed the information and nodded in understanding. "K. Thanks, Zawa," he said with a beaming smile. The class smiled at his bright smile and turned to Aizawa, who was ready to retire right then and there. Moving along the dorms. If you break something, fix it. If you can't fix it, figure it out. You are old enough. He moved to open the front doors and walked in with the class following. Your belongings are already in front of your rooms. Boys are on the right wing and girls on the left wing. He turned and glared at the whole class. I do not have to remind you of boundaries, do I? No, sir, the class said in unison. Good. Decide on who does what for chores. Dietary needs have been provided for everyone. If there is a specific things needed, then make a list and it will be provided with the next shopping trip. Aizawa continued with the tour into the kitchen. With that, I am done. Good luck. He promptly turned and left through the front door, leaving one ace standing in the common room. Yairuzo was the first to break the silence. I suppose we should settle in and put our belongings away. The class agreed with the statement and they dispersed to find their rooms. Ah, I'm on the 3rd floor. Kaminari complained as they checked out the map of each floor. You want to switch? He looked to Shiro, who was on the 1st floor. The layout was made for a specific reason. Ida chopped his arm up and down. I kinda want the 3rd floor, Shiro said while looking around. He grabbed a pen and quickly crossed out Kaminari's name and replaced it with his and did vice versa with his. There, he said proudly. That's against the rules. Ida admonished. There are rules. Izuku asked, confused. No one told me. After a second of processing that, everyone quickly began to make bargains to switch rooms. To Ida's dismay, everyone had switched rooms except for Izuku and Ida. In the end, Yairuzo made a new map of the building's rooms since the original one was filled with crossed-out names over and over again. From there, everyone began to bring their belongings to the room they traded for. It was complete chaos. Izuku watched it all happen with Ida at his side. He scratched his stomach and said,
I'm hungry.
And moved to the kitchen. Ida could only cave into the controlled chaos and went to his room to put his belongings in order. Now, Izuku didn't know how to cook in terms of using pots, pans, or any kind of utensils, so he rummaged around the cabinets to find something that smelled somewhat appealing. He found a myriad of smells that assaulted his sensitive nose, from spices to a bug flower. He dipped his finger in the flour to taste it, but he didn't much care for the taste. He'd had tastier bugs before. Setting the flour back where it was, the feral boy continued to search until he opened one particular cabinet. His pupils contracted like a cat as he quickly scanned each neatly arranged box. Tendrils extended from his hands as he shifted and moved everything to find the scent. The tendrils split dozens of times with fine hairs to find what he was looking for. It didn't take long before he pulled out a box with a chibi lamb, giving the buyer a thumbs up next to the brand name of the snack. They were lamb snack sticks, just like he had with Nem at the pharmacist's. She was truly a wonderful mother. With eager anticipation, he opened the box with a half-dozen tendrils helping cut it open and set the top to the side. He gently removed 2 snacks. He would save the rest for another day and placed the now open box back in the cabinet. He paused before closing it. He was part of a pack and sharing was included in that, but he didn't want to share his snacks. He was the pack leader. He could be selfish if he wanted. With that, he nodded and looked around to find the marker the pack had used to rewrite the dorm rooms. He wrote in big letters to lay claim and nodded in satisfaction. Izuku sat down on the reinforced couch to savor his snacks. He was ever grateful for having been found by such a thoughtful mother like Nem. He was still warm inside at the thought of having Nem as his mother as he finished his snack. With a lazy yawn, he curled up on the couch for a nap with sweet thoughts of his mom and lamb snack sticks. Mina stepped into the common room to find some of her classmates or packmates. She found herself saying more often, chatting quietly. The TV was on, but the volume was low as it played an old movie. She looked around curiously at the quiet room and found out why. Her mate was napping on the couch. She giggled and skipped over to him and the small enough space for her to squeeze between his head and the armrest. She paid no mind to the rest of her packmates' teasing smirks as she sat down carefully. Her mate grumbled something in his sleep but snuggled closer to her as he continued to nap away. She caressed his hair as he slept and looked up to see most of her pack mates watching the scene with smiles of every kind. She blushed and waved at them to mind their business, and they did so with chuckles. Mina relaxed on the sturdy couch with Izuku's head just about on her lap. She took out her phone to swipe through memes as she soaked in the nice atmosphere they had created so quickly. Toshi arrived at the common room much like she had, confused until he spotted Izuku's napping form. He scowled good-naturedly at him for being able to sleep anywhere before taking a seat on the ground in front of his best friend. What? Jealous that Zu can sleep?
Mina tia said Toshi.
He glanced back at his friend and then back forward to the movie. Maybe, he grumbled. After a pause, he asked, "You think he's gonna like living in the dorms?" He turned to look at her. She furrowed her brows and paused in stroking her mate's hair. "Whatcha mean? Like with other people?" When Toshi nodded, she thought about it before answering. There might be some friction at first. Being solitary for so long and then suddenly this might be a bit much for him. But from what I've grown to understand is that he adapts quickly to everything. Sure, there might be some things that might happen, but I think it'll be all right. She smiled confidently down at Izuku and then Toshi. The brainwasher took that in and nodded in acceptance. He does have that well down. Adaptation is part of him. He glanced from Izuku's paws to his slowly transforming arm from tendrils to a regular arm. Izuku is the definition of adaptation. It's honestly terrifying if wasn't so neat to see, Jairu said from the recliner next to them. She used her earlobe to point at Izuku as she continued. I mean, it would be scarier than shit to see him on the opposing side and not holding back all the time. Holding back? Izuku doesn't hold back. Kaminari snorted a laugh. Kaken strolled up behind the couch where his old friend was sleeping and scowled down at the electric user. Earlobes is right, he does hold back a lot. The only time I've seen him not hold back was at the USJ against that Nomu. The only reason that thing isn't a bloody stake is because it could heal fast. Shoji nodded. I remember that fight, it was animalistic. I saw the aftermath of the Nomus at the camp and it wasn't any different. He stared at his friend sound asleep. It's quite endearing to know he wouldn't go that far with any of us. He chuckled. It's not that bad, right? Kaminari asked a bit paler than usual. He's literally the perfect bioweapon and has the mind to use it. For fuck's sake. He would have had parasites eat the guy who ashed his arm if he wasn't lucky enough to just lose a leg. Kaken grimaced at the memory of being so useless for that short time of being discombobulated and vulnerable. Bad words, Izuku mumbled in his sleep and leaned into Mina's hand on his head. His mate smiled warmly at the action. Toshi snorted. Don't say bad words, Kaken. He laughed softly. Kaken scowled at him and then the rest of the present class when he saw the smiles. Shut up, troll hair. He left Toshi offended in favor of following Izuku's footsteps in scavenging for a snack in the kitchen. You guys don't think he'd, go eldritch horror on us? Kaminari asked shakily and eyeing Izuku snoring softly on the couch. As likely as any of us would. Kirishima gave the benefit of the doubt to the feral boy. He just can do so easier is all. He shrugged. The class who were present in the common room continued to chat, jumping from subject to subject. It was easy to get along with their class president's way of greasing the wheels of coming together. The pack of 1A began to become more comfortable with each other as the hour passed. It would make things easier since they would be living together for the foreseeable future or until Aizawa got sick of them, whichever came first. Izuku groggily woke up with his head on his mate's lap. He wasn't sure how he ended up there but smiled anyway at seeing Mina look down at him with her golden black eyes. She dipped down to kiss his forehead. Have a good nap? She asked smiling. Izuku felt that warm feeling in his chest again and nodded dazed. I like you, he said bluntly. There were many snorts and coughs of surprise from around the common room, but none so loud as Toshi, who barked out a laugh at the side of the couch. Mina's face darkened from being flustered but was becoming used to Izuku being blunt about his feelings about who he cares about or anyone in any matter. After cleaning her throat and regaining herself, Mina responded. I like you too, she said more quietly but no less honestly. Her face was still hot as she ignored the others in the room. "You remind me of my parents, it's nice," Tsuyu said just as bluntly as Izuku. Izuku got up from Mina's lap and stretched like a cat as he took in the room of just about everyone in his pack. He caught the scent of Aizawa, who had come but left quickly after. He absent-mindedly scratched his arm with a tendril and remembered that he still needed to work on breaking down the iron supplement for reconstructing the missing limb. Maybe some more reading of Asato's gift while at it. With a nod, he got up and patted Toshi's head. He waved his hand off as he passed him on the ground. "Where are you going?" Mina asked while still a bit flustered from before and Tsuyu's comment. "Getting pills," he said cheerily as he looked around briefly before finding where his room was with his stuff. Conjuring his room key from his forearm, he quickly went inside to grab a few bottles of supplies and his book. One benefit of his tendril arm was that he could split a few from being a hand to hold onto the pills and open the door for him. As he made his way to the common room again, he opened one bottle and consumed the whole thing in one go. Most of his pack looked at him worriedly. He stopped with a mouthful of supplements and tilted his head in confusion. "Whatcha got there, bud?" Kirishima asked first. Izuku swallowed the mouthful and showed his book. "Advanced Animal Biology. Asato gave it to me for my birthday," he said, beaming with the thick book facing everyone to see. "And the pills?" Zero probed. "Should we call someone?" He looked around unsure what to do. "Iron supplements for my arm. It takes a lot of iron and carbon," he explained and made to sit next to Mina with his legs tucked under him and book on his lap. He shifted for a moment before getting comfortable and leaned slightly against Mina. "I still have to eat lots of charcoal for the carbon, and that's tedious. I could make a new arm right now, but it would be weaker and break more often than not. Although, I'm not minding this arm." He rambled on about his thoughts like he usually did alone with no one to hear him talk to himself. He missed the relaxation of most of his packmates except for his closest friends who already knew of the pills. "Is that healthy? To take so much at a time? I know your biology is very different, but it seems excessive." Yairuzo asked tactfully and motioned to the bottles of iron supplements. "I can manage this much, but it can be too much to break down, so I just do one bottle at a time." "How much carbon do you need? What ratio are you using?" Yairuzo asked in curiosity. 2 grams per every 100 grams of iron." He shrugged. It was the easiest way to manipulate the steel in his bones. Yairuzo nodded and produced a bottle similar to the one Izuku held and handed to him. "Carbon supplements. Come back if you run out." She smiled. Izuku took the bottle gratefully and held it to his chest. "Thanks, Ruzo," he said, beaming. He made a note mentally to bring food for her as a thank you gift. Yairuzo blushed slightly at the earnestness of Izuku. "Of course, happy to help a friend." Mina smiled happily at the scene and leaned on Izuku's shoulder. He smiled down at her and continued to do his work between building his arm and reading about unique animal biological systems and organs. Currently, he found himself engrossed in the subject of ribbon worms, which are commonly known. They have an interesting way of consuming their prey by extending a net of sorts and eating it after injecting a mild poison into their prey. While Izuku had played around with the idea of venom, he didn't have any good way of testing the potency. He could test it on himself, but his cells and body are much sturdier and resilient to most things. So he ignored the possibility of such a thing, but he was still introducing how the ribbon worm extends a net so quickly. Maybe he could make something that would open up after being thrown like a javelin but not death-inducing. Bit by bit, the pack began to head to bed with Mina, Toshi, and Izuku being last. The pack leader had paid little mind to everyone heading to sleep as he was engrossed in the idea of experiments. He was brought out of his thoughts by Toshi patting his arm. He turned to him after a moment of finishing reading a section. "MH?" he asked, distracted. "I think you should get Mina to bed," Toshi said, nodding at the pink girl, currently wrapped around Izuku's arm and snoring quietly. Her horn was digging into Izuku's arm, but he didn't mind. "Oh, I'm sure. Where is her room?" Izuku glanced around and found the modified dorms. With his enhanced eyes, he could see well enough in the dark and far away to see she was on the 2nd floor. Izuku had his tendrils put his book away, and then he moved gingerly to pick up his mate. It was easy to slip out of her arm by compressing his arm and sliding it out of her grasp. With no hesitation, He picked her up in a princess carry like he had done other times and stood up with no effort. He followed Toshi as he guided him to her room. Mina's head was in the crook of his arm as they rounded the corner of the hallway. They stopped in front of the door and stared at it. They had the same thought as Izuku had a tendril try to open it to no avail. He looked to Toshi and Toshi looked back. Eraserhead gave me some training in lock picking, but I wasn't very good at it, Toshi admitted while rubbing his neck. I don't know what that is. Can't I just... Izuku trailed off as one of his tendrils snaked into the lock and filled it. After a moment of Izuku's face locked in concentration, there was a click, and the door opened easily. Izuku beamed in pride at the accomplishment. Nice! Toshi nodded in appreciation. He motioned Izuku in with Mina as he waited outside. Izuku set his mate in her bed and pulled the covers over her. She furrowed her brows and grumbled in her sleep but didn't wake. He smiled down at her and hesitantly kissed her forehead. With that, he nodded and left her to smile in her sleep. Izuku nodded at Toshi's inquiring raised brow. He nodded back and the two friends left for the living room. Izuku found his spot on the couch to continue his reading and Toshi found a spot on the other side of the couch to continue to play on his phone with cat pictures on it. Chapter 41 Training. Izuku woke up by sniffing the air. He shuffled around until he got out from under the coffee table and looked around with bleary eyes. He cleared his eyes quickly with his quirk. He looked up at the kitchen to see a few of his packmates already there eating or looking for something to eat. He found his mate at the stove. With a yawn and a stretch that popped all his joints in succession, he made his way to greet his pack. He stopped by the couch as he spotted his best friend sleeping face down on it. He recalled all the times Toshi had woken him up and his smile grew terrifying as he thought up a perfect revenge plan. His tendril arms stretched out over him and thin carapace legs in pairs of 8 began to crawl along his back. Over a dozen spiders walked over his sleeping form. At first, there wasn't much of a reaction, but once the limbs crawled on his exposed skin like his arms and legs, he began to twitch. When one crawled on the nape of his neck, he jolted away with a scream. He swiped his hands all across his body to get rid of the arachnids, but stopped when he saw his best friend standing at the head of the couch with a shit-eating grin that threatened to split his face. While huffing in breaths he lost in the panic, he pointed at Izuku. "You, me," the feral boy said serenely. Toshi lunged at Izuku to strangle him, but with a mad cackle he leapt over him. He clung to the wall like a spider and skittered away all while laughing. He disappeared over the balcony to the second floor as Toshi glared at him. He turned to the audience of Yairuzo, Ida, Mina, and Kirishima. Mina snored a laugh and went back to cooking on the stove. Yairuzo shrugged and went back to her tea and book. Kirishima kept staring at where his class president disappeared in wonder at how fluidly it looked. Ida was rubbing his eyes in exasperation at the behavior but let it be. He was beginning to get used to Izuku's unique proclivities. Toshi brushed his hair back and made his way to the kitchen. Sato came down the stairs just before Toshi sat down at the kitchen counter. Izuku just skittered out the second-story window. Should we be worried? I'm sure he isn't hurt, but... Sato left the rest unsaid. Mina waved the spatula in the air. It's fine. I've seen him take a 3-story fall without any harm. Well, permanent harm at least. She recalled the entrance exams. He's only gotten stronger. She finished and went back to putting the small mound of eggs on her plate with toast. Izuku appeared at the back door and peeked through it before opening it quietly. He was only noticed when he stood up to look to go with his hunt, maybe a lamb stick. There were a few sounds of surprise at seeing him so suddenly, but Izuku didn't pay any mind to it. Mina gently slapped his hand away from grabbing anything and pulled him away from his lamb. With an indignant whine at being pulled away, he looked at his mate who sat him down in front of a plate. Mina sat next to him with a smaller plate of food. "This is thanks for putting me to bed last night," she said quietly and bumped her head with his shoulder as he does frequently. "For me?" He looked at Mina in surprise. Only Nem and Onisuki had cooked for me before. He looked back at the plate of food and smiled at Mina in thanks. "Thank you," and began to dig in with a fork his mate had set next to the plate. Mina beamed in pride at him devouring his breakfast and turned to hers. She had cooked up a dozen eggs and taken 3 for herself. While not all of them stayed intact, she was sure Izuku didn't care if the yolk burst in a few eggs. Toshi had joined them with a bowl of cereal. With the sounds of eating, only the 3 packmates ate contentedly. Mina turned to Izuku as he slumped up a whole egg and toast. How'd you open my room? My key was still in my pocket. Did you go rooting in there? She asked teasingly, already aware that her teasing did not affect her mate. Mina, that is inappropriate insinuations. Ida lectured. What kind of insinuations? Izuku with true innocence. Everyone present turned to Ida, waiting for his response. Ida stood up slowly and pushed his glasses up. Apologies. I have a schedule I like to keep. With that, he placed his mug of tea in the sink while speed walking out the door and then sprinting with a water bottle in hand. It's nice to keep a schedule. Izuku nodded. Anyways, he moved on to Mina's question. Toshi told me about lock picking. Aizawa taught me it for underground hero work. Toshi added quickly, so as not to look like a criminal, right? So I put one of my tendrils inside the lock and just filled it the slots until I could turn it, he said proudly. Now I don't need keys. I am the key, he said while puffing out his chest. You're something all right, Toshi mumbled with a smirk. One of Izuku's tendrils became a fake spider and skittered toward him. He squashed it with his fist. Stop that. The dead spider was reeled back to Izuku and was absorbed into him. We still don't have classes. So what do you all do? He asked, looking around at the present pack members. Work put usually, Kirishima said, and Sato nodded in agreement. Or help with my parents' shop, Sato added. Train and study on formulas for chemical compounds, Ruzo said. Much like you do, but with inorganic material, she said, looking at Izuku. Just chill.
Mina hruget.
Or exercise, whichever is better at the time. She smiled. What are you nerds talking about? Kaken walked down the stairs in a black tank top and sports shorts, much like the other guys. What everyone does on their time off. What about you? Izuku answered with an egg balanced precariously on his fork, which he wasn't holding properly. Kaken took 2 pieces of toast and made a sandwich with the egg Izuku was holding on his fork. He nodded in appreciation of the taste and ignored the dirty look Izuku gave him for stealing a 9th of his breakfast. Work out. That's why I'm up so early. Kaken finished his sandwich and headed out to run with Sato and Kirishima, joining the explosive blonde. Izuku watched him go with narrowed eyes. He stole my food. Mina does it all the time, Toshi said while finishing up his cereal. But she's my mate. She can have what I have, he said in confusion at having to say the obvious. He turned to Mina, who pushed her face to his arm to hide the obvious blush on her face. When she peeked at him, he beamed at her. Toshi groaned at their actions. Get a room, you two. He placed his bowl in the sink and washed it quickly before heading to his room. Izuku shrugged and turned back to his eggs and Ruzo, who was watching the 2 mates with sparkling eyes. She blushed at being spotted and lowered the teacup she had been holding to her mouth during the whole interaction. She cleared her throat and set her tea down. I apologize. I quite enjoy romance novels and... She looked away, embarrassed from the 2. Right, I remember you told us earlier. I suppose I can see Zoo and I could be something like that, Mina said sheepishly but didn't stop leaning on his shoulder. Izuku let the 2 of them talk as he finished his eggs. More and more of his pack woke up and headed to the kitchen for their first meal of the day. Most of them dragged their feet in semi-states of slumber. When everyone separated to do their things, Izuku went to continue working on his arm. It was now right above the elbow and Izuku was ecstatic to be almost done. He still grumbled at the villain who turned it to ash, but he felt somewhat satisfied knowing he took most of his leg and he couldn't regenerate it, probably. While he worked, he moved on to reading one of the other books Asato had gifted Izuku, Quirk Biology. As it stands, every quirk is unique to everyone. The closest similarity between any 2 quirks is family relations. A parent and child could gain quirks that could be alike in every way, but there will always be a distinct difference between the 2. Whether it be a different light glow while activated or a different backlash for overuse. The feral boy continued to read in the branches of the front tree while the day passed. He was interrupted when the same cat stared at him from the branch next to him. The Bengal cat stared back as Izuku watched it carefully in return. What do you want? Izuku asked the cat. The cat's response to the query was to leap onto his branch and walk onto his lap where she, as Izuku noticed, began to walk in circles until she found a comfortable position and laid down. The cat purred in contentment and closed her eyes. "I see now." Izuku nodded and went back to reading his book. "Anyone see Izuku lately?" Kaminari asked suddenly in the common room. His question didn't distract him from the video game he was playing on the TV. "Probably eating some poor animal that caught his attention," Kaken said on the couch, playing the same video game against Kaminari. "He said he eats only when necessary," Kuta said quietly with his pet rabbit on his lap. "He's fine," Jairu said while she played on her phone. She didn't look up as she pointed outside. "He's in the tree, I think, reading and talking to himself." Jairu looked up to look at Toshi with a raised brow in question. Toshi shrugged at the unasked question. 10 years of mostly isolation would make you do that. He does talk to himself sometimes, but less now that he has others to speak to. He waved at all of them in the common room. The class was reminded again of Izuku's past. They were again saddened to recall how exactly he ended up in that situation. While the class thought of that, Izuku was outside on the tree branches arguing with the cat about the pros and cons of trying to integrate another's quirk into his body by consuming some of the person's DNA and trying to add it to his. He was mostly against it since messing with his DNA was extremely dangerous and he didn't have any grasp on it. The cat finally relented as she chirped and laid back down. Argument lost. A few days passed and the class was in their hero suits again. They all were lined up in front of Midnight, Aizawa, Cementos, and Ectoplasm. Aizawa just finished explaining the reasoning for gaining super moves and how they were going to work on them until it was time for the provisional hero license exams. Izuku nodded along with most of what his mom was saying about how the moves could turn the tide of battle or change the environment to suit them. Ida here has a great example of a super move. His Recipro Burst, while limited for the time being, can change the outcome of any battle if used at the right time. Midnight pointed the whip in her hands at Ida. "Do my shifts count as super moves?" Izuku asked. "Transformation quirks have been more difficult, say, with super moves. It's but for your, I would have to say yes," Ectoplasm said. "But that doesn't mean you get to slack off. You will work on more combinations," Aizawa said, staring at Izuku. "K." He beamed and paused. "Can I try one now?" he asked. Aizawa was about to deny it, but Nem cut him off. "Of course. Let's see what you have," Nem said happily, much to Aizawa's annoyance. Izuku beamed at his mom and made some space between the pack and him, just in case. First, he felt where he was going to extend the limbs but paused at the first obstacle, his shirt. He took it off without a care in front of everyone. "Close your mouth, you'll catch flies," Toshi said next to Mina. Jairu snorted on the other side of the packmate's mate. "Shut up." Mina did so and jabbed at Toshi. Everyone's attention was drawn back to Izuku, who had his face contorted in concentration as his back flexed and 2 limbs shot out of his back. The sound of tearing flesh still made many flinch, but they were awed by what they saw. 2 massive wings protruded from Izuku's back. They were draconian with scales on the main limb connecting to his body, and the skin in between each finger was almost transparent. The end of the wings ended in a sharp bone spike. If the whole class was next to Izuku, his wings would be able to shadow all of them. Everyone watched in silence as Izuku experimentally flapped them and sent gusts of wind in every direction. His grin could only be described as feral as he crouched down and leapt while his wings flapped downward. The ground slightly cracked where he was standing. Everyone heard Izuku cackle as he was airborne. With his horns and canine legs, he looked intimidating in everyone's eyes. He experimentally leaned forward in an attempt to fly, but he was sent into a nosedive. The image of a winged beast was shattered as Izuku yelped in surprise and then body slammed the ground and laid face down on the concrete. His wings flapped slowly and then lay still as he groaned in pain. "Izuku!" Nem shouted in worry and ran over to him. Mina was closer and arrived at his side. His packmates all gave him space but looked on in worry. "He's fine," Kaken said out loud. His arms crossed casually. "Most likely," Toshi agreed. "That hurt." Izuku whined from the ground. The skin on his face and chest healed and his wings folded in so he could roll over. Nem and Mina winced at seeing the worst kind of road burn knit closed on his body. How's your head?
Nem checked.
Fine, need to practice more, Izuku said and sat up with some difficulty with the added weight of wings. Some tendrils extended and helped him sit up. Well, you get the idea. Find a spot and get to it, Aizawa said, never having left his spot. The class dispersed with some looks back to Izuku as he stood up and dusted himself off. Mina made sure he was all right and then bumped her head with his shoulder and ran off to begin working on her super moves. Izuku smiled after her and looked at his wings. We can have a specialist come and help you with flying, Nem offered, not as a teacher but as a mother. Izuku thought about it but shook his head. I want to do it myself. He looked around at the ceiling to make sure he had enough room. Nem smiled at her son and nodded. Call me or anyone over if you need any help. All right? She ruffled his hair and left him to his own devices. The class spent their time working on their super moves while they heard the loud crash from another failed landing from Izuku. They all worked just as hard as their pack leader to make sure none of them dragged the pack down. Bit by bit, Izuku got the hang of flying and was able to land successfully a third of the time while the rest were a mess of limbs and yelps of pain at crashing. Yagi watched as Izuku landed in a stumble close to him. My boy, you grew wings. He stated the obvious. I grew wings, Izuku confirmed with a smile. You better now? He asked the number 1 hero. As good as I can be. Yagi smiled at the boy's question. The two walked and talked for a bit. Yagi gave some tips to Izuku on flying he had heard from other winged heroes he had met. Izuku took it all in stride and tried a few of his suggestions only to crash against the wall when he tried to push off it. Yagi gave him an encouraging smile and headed off to help others with their moves. Izuku continued to lie on the ground in thought. While he could flap around for a bit, maybe he was off balance. He hummed in thought and grew his tail to see if it would help him with flight like it helped him keep balanced while running. He took to the air and immediately felt a difference in how easier it was for him to move around in the air. He did laps in the building and even landed successfully without stumbling. He beamed in pride as he took off again. Chapter 42. Is it time yet? Kirishima was launched back once again and he got up again. He was huffing and puffing as he stared down his opponent who seemed right as rain. Izuku grinned back as he let the other teen catch his breath. The two have been sparring for the past half hour in an attempt to help Kirishima try something new with his quirk. The redhead had come up to Izuku and asked him to help him out since they both had transforming quirks. The feral boy was more than happy to help. The only thing was Kirishima was a fist fighter at heart and Izuku was feral animal. Growing up in the forest ingrained in a fighting style in Izuku similar to wolves. He weaved in and out of attack range while hitting weaknesses. Kirishima threw a punch and Izuku ducked under his arm to jab at his side and kick his knee. Kirishima tried to grapple and Izuku dodged back and then pounced on the boy when he was off balance. Izuku also wasn't scared to use underhanded tactics such as throwing rubble at Kirishima's eyes or attacking while he was down. Ready, Shima? Izuku asked with a grin. His knuckles were ready at his sides. His flesh was pulled back and hardened steel bones were open to the air. How, are you not tired? Shima asked in between breaths. Izuku shrugged. I don't know. I think I need a break. Shima knelt where he was across from Izuku. Thanks for the help. I think I have a good idea of where to go from here. The redhead beamed at his classmate. Izuku beamed back. All right, see you later, he said with a wave. As he walked away, he sniffed the air and looked to the entrance of the gym to see one bee stretching along the walls. Aizawa and Vlad were chatting not far from them. He brightened at seeing them and ran over to greet his friends. Monoma saw him and smiled in greeting. Izuku, it's good to see you well, ah. The copycat trailed off at seeing his almost regenerated arm. I heard of your injury. How is it? Izuku tilted his head in confusion. Injury? Monoma motioned to his arm and he looked at it. Oh, he said in understanding. It's fine. I'm almost done. It doesn't hurt or anything, he said with a shrug. Monoma smiled at his cavalier attitude towards his missing limb. Kendo approached from the side to join in the conversation. Izuku, I never got the chance to thank you for helping my class back to camp. So, thank you. She bowed towards him and straightened with a smile. Izuku smiled back proudly. I was happy to help. How is your training? Monoma asked. It's a bit tricky for me since my quirk is dependent on who is around me at the time, he said with a sigh. Great, I can fly now, Izuku said, preening at the surprised looks on their faces. Wanna see? Very much so, Monoma said, and Kendo nodded in interest. Izuku backed off and took off his shirt in front of everyone. There were many surprise noises and a few wolf whistles. He didn't notice the few covering their eyes with red faces or the drooling face of Tokage. He focused on his wings and they burst out his shoulder blades. He stretched them out and grinned back at 1B. Oh God, he can fly, Vlad said from the side. That's very intimidating and incredible, Monoma said in awe of the wingspan. Thanks. Izuku beamed and folded his wings to his back. He tilted his head at hearing Kaken's voice and he turned around. Oi! Stop stripping in front of everyone, you damn exhibitionist, Kaken yelled from atop a concrete cliff. Don't say bad words. And I have too. I don't want to tear my clothes. Also, what's an exhibitionist? Izuku yelled back. Don't tell me what to do. Go to the support department to get it fixed, Kaken yelled in return, purposefully ignoring the last question. Stop yelling or you both have detention, Aizawa yelled, glaring at the two. The support department is where our stuff gets made for hero work, like our costumes, items, and such. They probably can help you with that, Kendo explained. That seems handy. Where is it? I don't mind showing you, Tokage said, arriving at Izuku's side. She was grinning and showing off all her shark-like teeth. You can call me Set. Away with you, harlot. Mina arrived at Izuku's side and pushed Tokage's face away. The head detached and the body remained. He's taken, she hissed at the floating head. Izuku peered into the open neck to see a black slate where her blood and tissue should have been. Quirks are weird, he said, still looking in curiosity. His second pair of eyes opened to give him a different view. His mantis shrimp eyes didn't see anything other than black like his normal eyes did. Like you should be talking. Tokage snorted and motioned to his horns, legs, forearm composed of tendrils, and large wings. Izuku looked down at himself and then at his wings. He flapped slightly. He looked confused. What's wrong with how I look? Said the walking apocalypse, waiting to snap. Don't listen to her. She's just jealous she can't have you, Mina said primly and walked off with Izuku's arm hooked with hers. She turned to stick her tongue at the floating head one last time. What was that about? Kendo asked, confused at the normally friendly Pink girl's behavior. Pinky has been possessive of the nerd ever since they got back from their date over the weekend. He took her out for her birthday, and then they came back with her clinging to him like he was going off to war the next day, Kaken said near them. He crossed his arms and stared at the two leaving and heading to the support department. My guess is some girl got too friendly with the animal and he obviously didn't know and she got jealous. He shrugged. Monoma pursed his lips and slowly nodded. I can see that happening. It'll pass, probably. Kaken shrugged and followed the two mates to change and head for the dorms. Izuku eyed his mate cautiously. He was sure she wouldn't get angry at him, but he didn't like seeing her like she was at the moment. Are you still angry at that girl? From our date? He asked carefully. I get that she recognized you from the sports festival, but to suddenly jump on you? The nerve. And it wasn't just some excited hopping, but she pounced on top of you. If I wasn't trying to get my hero licenses. She said the last part with quiet anger. She gripped his arm tighter. Izuku nodded along with her rant. At the time, he was so surprised that a random girl their age had leapt on him with no ill intentions that he simply fell with her on top of him. The random girl began to take dozens of pictures with her leaning on him in the middle of the park the two UA students had been walking through. Mina was extremely caught off guard and didn't react immediately. It was only when Izuku began to try to push the girl off of him that Mina acted and helped. More through the girl off of Izuku. It turned out she had an animalistic quirk related to a dog, and his presence had changed to something loving with his time with Mina unknowingly, and her admiration of Izuku from the sports festival compounded with that. Izuku pulled his arm from Mina's and pulled her into a hug. I only want you as my mate, he said simply to put her at ease. Mina was startled slightly at the hug since she was the one to initiate them, but she hugged him back. She melted at the words he said, and she buried her face in the crook of his neck with a blush. How is it you can always make me blush? Because I'm your mate, he said beaming. I swear Namuri is feeding you lines, she mumbled. Izuku tilted his head in confusion. Feeding me lines? What kind of food is that? Mina pinched his cheeks with both hands. You are so precious. Come on, let's go to the support department. I'm sure they could fix your clothes problem. She let go of his cheeks and moved her hand away from a half-handed attempt to bite it. Izuku smiled at her and moved his wing to hug her. She laughed at the large appendage wrapping around her before it retracted and the wings were sucked back into his body. He put on his shirt again and they made their way to the support department. The two arrived at the blast door and Izuku frowned at it as he sniffed the air. He sneezed at the overwhelming odor of oil, burning metals, and other things he couldn't put a finger on. Mina giggled at his kitten sneeze and moved to open the door. She backed away when a large plume of black acrid smoke bellowed out. Izuku's senses practically shut down to save them from the black miasma. Mina waved her hand in front of her face to save her lungs while backing away. Power Loader stumbled out coughing so harshly you'd think he was trying to eject a lung on purpose. He quickly began to push buttons on his wrist device as soon as he could breathe normally. Loud fans started up and all the toxic air was sucked into the vents around the room. Hatsum, if you are going to test something, use the chambers. That's what they are there for. He shouted into the room where a pink-haired girl with an advanced gas mask was covering her face. She stood up from what was her experiment and removed the mask to make notes on what she saw more carefully. She didn't pay attention to the teacher yelling at her or the two others behind him. Loader, this is where you work? Is it always so smelly? Izuku looked around at the room with dozens of devices he couldn't name to save his life. Power Loader looked at him. Oh, Izuku, yes, welcome to my department. What brings you here? Customers? Hatsum jerked up from what she was doing and quickly approached. Izuku didn't let her get closer than an arm's length, so his mate wouldn't get upset again. Tendrils extended from his hand and wrapped around her waist before she got too close. My clothes keeps ripping when I do things. Like I can grow wings, but I don't want to rip my shirt. Can you do something about it? He didn't pay attention to the girl trying to escape his tendrils. Power Loader looked at Hatsum and then Izuku and then Mina, who looked too satisfied. He brushed it all off and focused on Izuku. We could do a few things. Izuku felt a shock that traveled up the tendrils to his arm and into his very conductive bones. He yelped and released Hatsum from her confines. I've got the baby just for you. Introducing my personal favorite, Jetpack version 2.8. She held up a metal backpack with twin thrusters on the bottom. Never again will you have to worry about flying. Izuku recovered from his shock and reminded himself to work on something to prevent electricity from stunning him just like now. But I can already fly, he said confused. What about what Toru has? Mina asked Power Loader. Toru. The hero repeated to remember the name. He snapped his fingers and pointed at Mina. Hagakure, invisible, right? Yes, something like that would work. We would just need enough hair for the cloth. He nodded. How about a crossbow with multiple variants of ammunition? I've got smoke, explosives, electricity, and even expanding foam. Although, I don't recommend skin contact with the foam unless you... Anyways, anything catch your fancy? Hatsum rambled on and showed off things she made to Izuku, who eyed the crossbow. I can do that, Izuku mumbled in thought. He hummed with pursed lips and extended his arm where the arms of a crossbow grew, and then tendrils connected a line of sinew for the line. A deadly sharp bolt was loaded into it with the help of more tendrils. Once done, he twitched his finger and the bolt zipped through the air and embedded into the wall. Izuku's eyes shone with the new idea as he admired the crossbow that was fixed to the back of his forearm. We should have never let Snipe show him how to use firearms, Power Loader said quietly as he watched the whole thing happen. Cellular manipulation? If I was more interested in the biological part of support items, I would be all over you, but I'm not. Hatsum examined the crossbow on Izuku's arm and then shrugged. The feral boy's thoughts raced as he began to get new ideas about his newest weapon and how he could put it to use. He was brought out of his thoughts when his mate poked his cheek. He turned to her with his usual smile and she motioned to Power Loader with a smile. Power Loader was smirking at Izuku. We're gonna need a lot of your hair for what I have planned. He held out a bag to Izuku. Tendrils grabbed it and held it open. How much? He looked up. Fill it up if you can. How do those things work again? Izuku mumbled to himself as a tendril snaked inside the bag, and then green and black hair began to grow rapidly from the tendril. Quickly enough, the bag was filled, and then the hairs on the tendril fell on their own. He closed the bag and handed it to Power Loader. That was creepy, Mina said. Not the weirdest thing I've seen. Power Loader said, taking the bag. Give us a bit, and your new costume will be ready, and you won't have to worry about going nude to use your quirk. He barked out a laugh. The two mates arrived back at the dorms out of their costumes. It was getting dark as they opened the doors. The girls of 1A were chatting to the side, and Mina quickly went to join after kissing Izuku on the cheek. For his part, he wandered to the kitchen for a snack, more specifically a lamb stick. Many of the guys were in the kitchen cooking up their meals for dinner. Izuku weaved through them all to get to his lamb stick and then out the back door, avoiding the chaos in the kitchen. Izuku arrived at his den with a few rodents he caught on the way. With practiced movements, he lit the fire, skinned and dressed the food, and finally sat down to snack on the lamb while the rodents got cooked. His tendrils snaked into his den and grabbed one of his books and a bottle of iron supplements. He felt something dig into his tendril as he pulled it out. He held his tendril in front of him with the Bengal cat dangling from it. She saw it was him and let go to land softly on the ground. Izuku frowned at the cat who had invaded his den. The cat looked up at him and chirped before darting into his den again. He began to feel indignant at the nerve of the cat sleeping in his den, but paused when the cat came back with a dead badger. She slowly dragged it out of his den and finally dropped it in front of the owner of the territory. She chirped at him and placed a paw on the badger before backing away. He watched the cat in curiosity. "This is for me? Your payment to live here?" he asked the cat. The cat chirped once more in the firelight. Izuku looked down at the badger larger than the cat and then at the cat who waited patiently for his response. "Very well, you can stay in my den." Before the cat could begin to purr in success, Izuku spoke again. "But you will not touch my trophies or I will eat you," he threatened. The cat had her ears flattened against her head at the sudden declaration, but rolled over to show her belly to him in supplication of his order. She meowed loudly before getting up and lying down close to the warmth of the fire to nap. About a week later, Izuku and the pack of 1A got off the bus to the testing location. He was the last off, making sure everyone was accounted for, and he looked around at the new scents and people close to their age. Just from a glance, he could see many new animalistic quirks he had never seen yet. He hummed in anticipation at the challenge he could feel ahead. He releases a pulse of his presence for everyone to feel. Hundreds of animal quirk users stiffened up at the sense they got for that split second. A top hunter had arrived in their midst for a challenge. They could almost taste the words written in the air. Were they worthy of being a trophy? The class caught the two animal quirks stiffen up just like the other hundreds had. They turned to Izuku, who was smiling lazily as he watched the crowds of students. "All right, I don't know what you're doing, but that's enough." Mina pulled him along, and he naturally went along with her request. Aizawa lazily glared at Izuku but continued. "This is where you'll go inside, change, and then take the exam. Don't disappoint me or UA." "Got it." Aizawa looked over the class. "Good enough now, Zawa? Who's that? She seems like she is speeding up." He was about to glare at Izuku for interrupting him, but paused to look over his shoulder. He let out a long sigh as he prayed for strength. "Aizawa, long time no see. Let's get married." The hero pulled Aizawa into a side hug. Mina squealed in excitement at the idea of marriage, but Aizawa cut it off at the root. "No." Aizawa pushed the green-haired woman off of him. "Class, this is Ms. Joke, an underground hero like me. You two seem close," Tsuyu said, already recovered from Izuku's intense presence. "Our agencies were close and we worked together a lot of the time, but I'm here just like he is. Meet my class, from Ketsubutsu Academy High School." Ms. Joke motioned to a group of gray uniform students. The lead held out a hand to Kaken first. "It's nice to meet the class that persevered so much this year." Kaken didn't take the hand and eyed him with some disgust. Izuku got close just as Kirishima was about to reprimand Kaken for the rude action. The feral boy sniffed the air and looked at the boy who was smiling oddly. "You smell like lies and fakeness." Kaken, what's that one word? With fake and lies. He turned from the startled boy to the blonde. Deceit, Kaken said bluntly. Izuku pointed at Kaken and nodded his head. You smell of deceitness. He pointed at the boy. That's not a word, you animal. Kaken yelled at his friend and slapped his pointing hand down. And stop pointing, you look weird. It is a word. I made it. Izuku slapped Kaken's arm in retribution for his slapped hand. Kaken reeled in pain from the metal-enhanced slap and put his old friend in a headlock. You can't make words up. Then how were words made? Izuku grunted out as his air was cut off. Kaken didn't have anything to say to that and froze as he tried to think of a comeback. He let go of Izuku as he felt a tongue on his arm slide up and down. What are you? 5. He pulled his arm away and used Izuku's uniform to dry off the wet spot from his saliva. And this is my class, Aizawa said dryly. Chapter 43. It's time to hunt. Hey, Roki. Todoroki didn't turn.
Roki, Roki.
Izuku poked him twice in the shoulder to get his attention, and he turned to the feral boy. He looked slightly confused. That's not my name. Why do you call me that? Izuku shrugged. It's less of a mouthful. Everyone has such long names, and I think it's better if they're short, like how Mina calls me Zu. Plus, I always call my friends with short names. He finished with a beaming smile. Oh, okay then. I like it. Roki smiled slightly at the shorter boy. Good. Anyways, what's with that guy who was glaring at you? The really tall, bald guy. Izuku held his hand above his head to show the height. He was at the recommendation entrance exams and placed first. He chose to go to another school instead. I believe it was because of me I was much more difficult than I am now, Roki said by explanation as he changed in the locker room with the rest of Class 1A's boys. Izuku nodded along as he listened. He shrugged and put on some pants finally. Maybe we'll fight him, he said eagerly. What's the recommendation entrance exams? You're joking. Kaken gave him a flat look and then shook his head. Of course, you're not joking, why would you? Izuku stuck his tongue out at him and listened as Roki explained. Every hero has one recommendation they can put for a hero school. My father recommended me. Our exam was a race with many obstacles in our way to the finish line. He finished putting his suit on and turned to their pack leader. Oh right, your dad is some hero I forgot. Roki smirked at that. Yes, just some hero, he said with too much mirth. Would you hurry the fuck up? It's like you like being naked all the time. Kaken yelled at his old friend. Izuku held up a finger and wagged it at him. Ima tell Aunt Suki you are saying bad words, he said seriously, and then he shrugged. I mean, it doesn't bother me, I guess. We could tell, Toshi said dryly. The boys grouped up with the girls and headed to the gathering room for all the examinees. Hundreds of people gathered in the large room, all with their unique quirks and colorful costumes. Izuku purposefully kept his senses dulled to avoid an overload of information. They all waited until a tired-looking man walked onto the podium. Izuku tried to pay attention, but his voice was very monotonous and caused his attention to drift around. He snapped back to attention when there was an uproar all around him. What happened? Izuku asked his pack. Only 100 of us will pass out of the 1,500. Kaminari whined. Oh, then make sure you pass then, Izuku said as it was obvious. His pack all gave him wry grins at his attitude and then nodded to each other with resolve to pass the exam. Officials came around to pass the targets out to everyone. Izuku was again confused but followed suit when his packmates began to put them on their bodies. He shrugged once again and placed one above his heart and one on each side of his torso. Once some time had passed and everyone had targets on their bodies, the room rumbled and split open. A massive arena was shown with more than enough space for everyone to find a good place to fight. That's what everyone did. They split up. Izuku's mouth began to water at the idea of so many things to hunt. He leapt in front of everyone. Have a good hunt, and turned to sprint to the wooded area he spotted immediately. Wait, you are leaving? Yairuzo asked. She saw Mina not looking surprised but looked even more resolved than most to pass the exam. I can pass and help you pass, but I won't. I will always protect my pack, but my pack needs to fight for themselves too, he said seriously. Then he beamed at all of them. You all will do good. Then he sprinted off. They were quiet for a short moment before Kirishima spoke first. He's right. He helped everyone back at the summer camp, but that doesn't mean we are reliant on Izuku. Let's all pass and show everyone we can take on anyone. The pack cheered and began to make plans and group up with each other. Even Kaken and Todoroki stayed after Izuku had said what he wanted to say. With Yairuzo, the three of them lead their group to pass the exam. The hunter sprinted over the arena to the wooded area. He was grinning from ear to ear in anticipation of the hunt ahead. He heard footfalls near him and turned to see others doing the same as he was. There were many kinds of people near him, from animalistic quirk users to plant quirks. The hunter turned back to the woods before him and laughed with glee at the upcoming event. Many of those who followed faltered at hearing such a laugh, but many more scorned his attitude of being outnumbered by other schools. They tried to follow him to corner him when the exam started, but no one could find him. Not by scent, sound, or line of sight. While the UA crushing was always targeted at their class as a whole, examinees often singled out a singular UA student. And none more than the winner of the sports festival and the boy who took out Stain the hero killer. While they searched where the lone boy went, the hunter already picked out his hunt. The hunter leapt from one tree branch to another with only the slightest rustling of leaves. His breathing was shallow and his eyes narrowed on his prey. A big examinee with black fur covering almost his whole body except his face and large hands. The hunter didn't know which school he belonged to, but he didn't care. The gorilla quirk user stomped on the ground with each footfall propelled by his large muscular arms. He stopped and sniffed the air only to snort and continue looking for another examinee to eliminate. He didn't get far as the hunter dropped onto his back and slammed a hammer fist on his massive shoulder. The gorilla stumbled forward with a grunt of pain and whipped his arms around to counterattack whoever ambushed him, but he only hit air. The fair sound of breaking twigs alerted him to the side, but the pain blossomed in his side, a fist dug into his ribs. With a roar of anger, he slammed his fists down on the ground, which shook the area. His opponent was finally revealed to be a small green-haired boy with horns and wolf legs. What caused him to pause were the eyes. The boy had eyes only a feral animal would have. There in his eyes shone a predator, and his wide smile only enhanced his thoughts. Only a coward would attack another in such a way. The gorilla huffed out. I wasn't aware UA had stooped so low. He baited the wild boy. The hunter tilted his head in confusion. But I'm a hunter. That's what I do. He stated it as it was obvious. He snorted a derisive laugh. A hunter? I only see a tiny weak boy. He charged and raised his fists into a double slam on the green boy. He didn't move and took the impact with his raised arms to block. A massive boom shook the area. The gorilla was horrified to see the boy still standing and smiling even wider. Quick as his eye could see, the boy used his arms as a lever to flip the massive gorilla examinee over his head to smash into the dirt ground. The wind was knocked out of him, and it was driven out again as the small but dense green-haired boy pounced on his chest. With the sound of grinding bones, claws extended from his hand and stopped right before the hairy throat. The gorilla froze at the implicated threat. Izuku pursed his lips in dissatisfaction. You need to be less restrained. I can imagine growing up everyone told you to be careful with your strength, but in a fight. Izuku shook his head with a sigh and retracted his clawed hand from his throat to the relief of the gorilla. I submit, the gorilla said morosely. Not a good hunt. Izuku got off his chest and on the way tore off an emblem from his uniform. He turned and left the gorilla stunned as he left the examinee still in the exam. He again disappeared into the trees to find another to hunt, but someone found him instead as a dozen quills shot through the leaves. He was hit 3 times and dodged a dozen more. He dropped from the trees onto the ground. He quickly ran through the trees as he continued to dodge the quills. He felt sluggish and looked at the quills. Some sort of poison? He quickly pulled them out and isolated the toxins before ejecting them from his body. He heard laughter from many others as he continued to weave through the trees to find a path of attack. He found who was shooting him quickly. A trio of boys worked together to pin down Izuku. One had the resemblances of a poison dart frog with greenish-yellow tinted skin, and the one shooting quills was a porcupine with quills shooting out of his arms. The frog boy smeared some liquid from his hands onto the quills, and then the other shot them. The last boy was a bird-headed boy who looked kinda like Tokoyami, but had an eagle head instead and wings for arms with hands at the end. Oh, it's one of the UA brats.
Yo.
We found one, the eagle boy shouted in a shrill voice to the woods. There was a roar of excitement from deeper in the forest. Izuku could only get more excited at the sound of the roar. He grinned and dashed for the porcupine. He grabbed a fallen tree and hurled it at the trio to buy some time as he closed the distance. The three leapt away from the missile with the eagle taking to the air and the frog leaping onto a tree and sticking on its surface. The porcupine wasn't so lucky and was clipped on the side. He was sent sprawling on the ground with a hiss of pain. Izuku was on him in a flash, but he recovered fast as he shot more poison quills into Izuku's chest. He paid it no heed as he slammed his fist into the porcupine and then picked him up before throwing him bodily at the frog, who was in midair in an attempt to help his classmate. They collided harshly and Izuku grinned savagely. There was a screech of an eagle as the third boy dove at Izuku. He dodged nimbly and avoided the razor talons digging into the earth. Just as Izuku was going to go after the eagle, there was the sound of a running animal on all fours. Izuku instinctively dodged back multiple times and was rewarded by only getting clawed once in the chest. Izuku took in the new arrival with eagerness. He could be only described as a werewolf, almost 7 feet tall with long arms for running on all fours. His hands were tipped in razor claws, one stained red with Izuku's blood. He had gray fur all over his body, including his muzzle, which sported vicious teeth. So this is the lone pup of UA. The werewolf growled out with mirth. He sniffed the blood on his claws and snorted. It should be an easy fight. My paralytic poison should be taking its toll by now. Frog Boy said smugly. More and more arrived to surround the lone UA student. All with the same uniform, most with some kind of animal quirk. They circled the leader of their class and his supposed prey. You should have stayed in your territory, pup. You are in the woods, and in the woods I am king. He roared, and the others circling Izuku cheered. Izuku took it all in with a smile on his face. His teeth could be seen by everyone. The others thought he had snapped and was in despair of being outnumbered, but Izuku was just excited. No, you're not. I am, Izuku said as he pulled the quills from his stomach and chest. The werewolf was quiet for a moment before barking out a harsh laugh. All you UA brats think they are the best, typical, he said with a sneer of derision. I've hunted many things. Rabbits, badgers, deer. He eyed each animal quirk user that matched with what he said, all while smiling. A bear, even a shark. But I've killed plenty of wolves. His teeth began to sharpen as he locked eyes with the werewolf. The green-haired boy's clawed chest knit closed before everyone's eyes. You say you are the king of the woods, but I earned the title. The new costume followed suit and knit closed at his command. The hunter shifted into his true form. Bones cracked and skin tore as his body changed. His lips were pulled back and his teeth grew interlocked. Bone plates covered the vulnerable parts of his face. His arms lengthened with razor claws with one hand made of lashing tendrils. He grew taller than the werewolf, his bony tail with a spear tip coiled around the ground with clinking movement. The hunter took in the stillness of the clearing as he breathed in and his 4 eyes locked onto the werewolf who looked frightened. I am the king of the woods, a dozen voices pronounced. I am the beast of the woods, he roared with his presence unleashed. The whole woods felt it and collapsed to their knees in fear, all but one who defiantly stood his ground. He stared into the werewolf's shaken eyes and pointed his clawed hand at him. You will be a good hunt, and he pounced. The werewolf dove out of the way of the claws that rent the earth where he stood into a crater. He yelped in surprise and instinctively clawed back at the beast who was the boy. The beast dodged easily as his tail whipped around and slammed into his side to launch him across the clearing. He rolled and got onto all fours before frantically running around to the back of the beast. It was no use as the hunter caught up to him faster than he could see. In a flash, his neck was in the hunter's claws and he was lifted before being slammed through a tree that shattered on impact. The tree fell and so did the werewolf who stumbled on the ground dazed by the impact. He didn't give up and got back up to lash out with frenzy attacks at the hunter who dodged or blocked the attacks. The werewolf managed to see the tail whip around to strike him once more and dodged just in time, but the fist to his muzzle threw him onto his back. The werewolf didn't yield just yet and tried to bite the beast as he neared. It was futile, as the only thing he managed was to be grappled by the clawed hand of the beast. His muzzle was held shut and the beast stared into his eyes in challenge. The werewolf growled but closed his eyes due to the combination of being overpowered so easily and the heavy weight of the constant presence aimed at him. He submitted to the true king of the woods. "You did good, but I am better," the hunter stated as he grabbed the emblem on his uniform and tore it off. He pulled out the ball he took with him at the beginning of the exam and tapped it against each target. With that, he left the defeated werewolf on the ground and turned to see the circle of students shivering on their knees. He moved to the unconscious porcupine and did the same as the werewolf. His targets glowed green and his task was complete. Finally, he retracted his presence and everyone let out a shaky breath. "Good luck to the rest of you." The hunter smiled, causing everyone to shiver. Massive wings exploded from his back, and with one earth-shaking leap, he was airborne, leaving a shaken group of students. With somewhat practiced movements, he began to fly toward the big arrow. He guessed that was the way and began to glide over the examinees. He observed the fights going on with eagle-eye precision. He was fascinated by all the unique people and quirks. Up in the viewing stands, Aizawa and Ms. Joke caught sight of the massive wings and the figure under them. Aizawa let out a sigh through his nose and shook his head at the feral student of his. "Damn! Would you look at the size of those wings? Who do you think they belong to?" Ms. Joke turned to her seatmate, who was Eraserhead. "Some brat," he said in his usually gruff voice. She snorted a laugh and turned back to see the winged figure stop in midair and turn in their direction. "What are they doing?" she mumbled. She pulled up the monocular she carried with her and looked through it to see something from a horror story looking back right at her and waving. "Holy hell," she said slowly. "He's waving, isn't he?" Aizawa didn't move an inch but stared back at the figure in the air. She turned to him in surprise. "How'd you know?" "Like I said, it's some brat." He glared at the flying figure and they dove away with a laugh that could be heard even from so far away. "Damn feral brat," he grumbled. Izuku swept through the air and caught sight of Kaken and some of his pack mates finishing a fight. He grinned at their successful hunt and dove down to watch closer. There were 6 in his group, with Kaken taking the lead in combat. Kaminari, Kirishima, Shiro, Shoji, and Ojiro fought around him. They were fighting on a faux highway against some students with nice hats and similar uniforms as to the big guy who glared at Roki. Izuku didn't interfere in their battle, but did land heavily on the highway sign to watch. His wings folded on his back and his tail swung lazily like a cat as he loomed over them all. There were a few screams of fright at seeing his appearance, but none from his packmates. He perched on the sign and almost tilted off until he shifted his paws into bird talons that dug into the metal under him for support. He watched as Kaken danced around with his quirk. Precisely used it to get the most out of his movements while also getting the full power delivered to his opponent, who was a copy of Kirishima but made of the concrete he stood on. The mimic Kirishima was launched back against the guardrail and dented it as he landed. His body turned to the metal of the rail starting at his hand and traveled up his arm. He got back up with a tired grunt but was slammed back down after a devastating explosion straight to his head. "What are you doing, nerd?" Kaken turned from his downed opponent to his old friend. "I don't need any of your damn help." "Bad words, Kaken." Izuku chastised him with a dozen voices and a wag of his clawed fingers aimed at him. "But no, I just wanted to watch." He dropped down from the sign onto the concrete, cracked at the impact and his weight. His talons shifted to paws again and he wandered around the battlefield. "You get your 2? Kaminari asked as he tapped the ball onto an unconscious examinee he fought. "Yep, I got 2 trophies too," he said with childish glee. He stooped down to pick up one of the Shiketsu uniform hats and looked at it. "This is mine now," he said with authority and placed it on his head. His messy curly hair slipped out the sides of the hat, but he hummed in contentment. "It suits you, Izuku," Shoji admitted. "The dark color goes well with your hair." "I gotta agree." Shiro's helmet opened to nod appreciatively. Izuku shifted back to his normal self and beamed at them. "Thanks. Should we really be taking their belongings like that?" Ojiro asked with apprehension. The animal already took trophies, what's another? Kaken shrugged. He turned to Izuku with a raised eyebrow. What did you take? Izuku proudly produced 2 patches with the same outline but different animals on them. One of a wolf howling to the moon and the other a gorilla pounding its chest and roaring the sky. The patches were still dangling threads from where they were ripped off the uniforms. One from a gorilla cork guy and the other from a werewolf. The werewolf was a good fight, he said, smiling at them all. Nice, Kaken said, and then turned to head to the exit. Let's get out of here, follow me nerds. Kaminari snorted. Says the guy who placed 4th in academic ranking. Kaken grinned viciously back at him as he walked. That's right, I'm the alpha nerd. Isn't that technically Izuku? Shiro smirked back and pointed at a puffed-up Izuku. Didn't he place 3rd? The group of boys laughed at Kaken's angry growl and stomping steps as they headed to the exit to the exams. Alright, legends, that's a wrap on part 6. If you enjoyed it, make sure to smash that like button and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Big thanks again to Big Teddy G3498 for this amazing series. Drop a comment below. What do you think of Deku's powers so far? I love hearing from you guys. Until next time, legends, stay awesome.